A billionaire ignored his pregnant wife for months, until their baby was born and she faced life-threatening complications. Before we immerse ourselves in the intensity of the story, please drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the narrative concludes, don't forget to rate its emotional impact from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more true life stories like this. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and absorb every chilling detail. The penthouse office on the 42nd floor of Vane Aerospace headquarters didn't just gleam. It radiated an aura of remote, untouchable power. Every surface reflected cold perfection. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a cinematic view of the entire Seattle skyline, a landscape Sullivan Vane had effectively conquered. Priceless abstract expressionist art adorned walls that had borne silent witness to the signing of countless multi-million and billion-dollar deals. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Sullivan Vane. At 37, his steel-gray eyes were currently dissecting quarterly reports with the ruthless precision of a master surgeon. Sullivan embodied power, quiet and absolute, the kind that didn't need to shout its presence. Standing an imposing 6 feet 3 inches, his broad shoulders perfectly filled the structure of his tailored charcoal suit, ensuring he commanded attention simply by existing. His dark brown hair, perpetually styled, never allowed a single strand to fall out of place. His jawline was so defined it looked as though it had been meticulously carved from granite, and his hands, strong, capable hands that had sealed deals that shifted global markets, moved across the documents with deliberate, economical efficiency. But those who watched him closely, and few dared to, might notice the faint, restless tension that coiled in his shoulders, or the near imperceptible tightening of his jaw when his gaze inevitably landed on materials concerning the aerospace division's family-oriented marketing campaigns. Sullivan Vane hadn't just built an empire. He was the empire, and empires, he knew too well, demanded unimaginable sacrifices. The intercom buzzed softly, breaking the controlled silence. "Mr. Vane, your wife called. She wanted to remind you about dinner at 7. Sullivan's platinum pen froze exactly 1 millimeter above the paper. Aurora. Even the sound of her name managed to soften something deep within his expression. A vulnerability no board member, competitor, or reporter had ever been granted access to see. "Thank you, Margaret. Cancel my 8 o'clock. "Of course, sir." Aurora Vane, formerly Aurora Winters, was the living antithesis of Sullivan's carefully constructed, sterile world. At 32, her beauty was inherent and luminous, requiring none of the social artifice prevalent in his elite circles. Her auburn hair cascaded in soft, effortless waves past her shoulders, framing a delicate heart-shaped face dominated by warm hazel eyes that frequently sparkled with genuine, unrehearsed mirth. She was petite, 5 feet 5 inches, yet her vital, vibrant presence effortlessly filled any space she occupied. Unlike the polished, ambitious socialites who orbited his sphere, Aurora maintained a demanding career as a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. Her hands, soft from constant washing but undeniably capable, had soothed the pain and fear of countless children. She favored minimal makeup, preferring the natural, healthy flush of true emotion to any cosmetic enhancement. When she smiled, which was often and freely, it utterly transformed her entire face, carving tiny, genuine crinkles around her eyes, lines that spoke eloquently of a life lived authentically and filled with simple, profound joy. Their marriage had been the most startling surprise to rock the foundations of Seattle's elite social scene. The ruthless billionaire aerospace mogul and the earnest nurse who drove a decade-old, slightly dented Honda Civic. But what others viewed as a completely improbable pairing, Sullivan recognized instantly as undeniable fate. Aurora had strolled into his life during a high-society charity gala she'd attended as a friend's +1. She wore a simple black dress that likely cost less than the strap of his watch. Yet somehow, she rendered every other impeccably dressed woman in the room utterly irrelevant. She hadn't known who he was, hadn't cared about his net worth or the breadth of his influence. She had simply looked at him with those brutally honest hazel eyes and asked if he was enjoying the evening, because, she noted, he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. He'd fallen, irrevocably, for her raw authenticity, her infectious warmth, and her innate ability to find sheer wonder in the smallest, most mundane moments. Aurora laughed heartily at slapstick comedies, wept openly during sentimental television commercials, and held an unwavering, fundamental belief in the inherent goodness of humanity. She was dazzling light where he was perpetual shadow, pure, untainted hope where he carried the crushing, hereditary weight of history. At precisely 7:15, Sullivan utilized his personalized key code to enter the front door of their queen and home, a magnificent, lovingly restored Victorian that Aurora had instantly fallen in love with during their frantic house hunt. She had deliberately dismissed the sleek, glass and steel modern mansions his realtor had prioritized, instead gravitating powerfully toward this house with its original, creaking hardwood floors, the sturdy stone fireplace, and the sweeping wraparound porch she claimed was perfectly engineered for enjoying quiet morning coffee. "You're late," Aurora called from the kitchen, but her voice held a tone of profound affection, entirely devoid of accusation. Sullivan found her expertly stirring something deeply fragrant on the stove. Her auburn hair was pulled back carelessly into a messy, appealing bun, and she wore faded jeans paired with one of his old, oversized college t-shirts that had mysteriously migrated into her daily wardrobe. She'd kicked off her sneakers, and her bare feet moved silently, gracefully, across the cool kitchen tiles as she completed preparations for their intimate dinner. "Emergency board call," he explained, moving immediately to approach her from behind and wrapping his arms securely around her narrow waist. "Forgive me." She leaned back completely against his chest, and he felt the relentless, tight coil of the day's accumulated tension begin to noticeably dissolve, piece by agonizing piece. "Always," she murmured into the stillness. "How was your day?" "Better now." And he meant it with every fiber of his being. In Aurora's immediate presence, the oppressive weight of executive expectations, the paralyzing pressure of maintaining his global empire, and even the faint, chilling echoes of his father's distant, judgmental voice, all of it receded instantly to manageable, distant levels. They ate dinner by the soft, flickering light of candles. Aurora eagerly shared detailed, often humorous, stories from her shift at the hospital, while Sullivan listened intently, occasionally offering a sharp insight, but mostly content simply to watch her animated expressions. She used her hands expressively when she spoke, gesturing widely when excited, and she had a charming habit of tilting her head slightly when she was deeply considering a thought. After dinner, they gravitated to the living room couch. Aurora effortlessly curled into his side, finding her perfect nestling spot, while he absently, soothingly stroked her hair. The evening felt miraculously perfect, suspended in the kind of profound contentment Sullivan had spent decades denying was even possible for someone forged in his world. "Sullivan," Aurora said softly, her voice suddenly carrying a careful, unfamiliar note he couldn't quite identify. "I need to tell you something." He felt her small body tense subtly against his, and his own powerful muscles responded instantly in kind. In his experience, conversations that began with that precise structure rarely, if ever, concluded happily. "What is it?" Aurora carefully pulled back just enough to look directly at him, her warm hazel eyes bright with an emotion he found utterly unreadable. She took a deep, steadying breath, reached for his hands across the fabric of his suit, and held them firmly in both of hers. "I'm pregnant." The two words didn't just hang in the air. They landed between them like a physical, disruptive presence, a bomb detonating the fragile peace. Sullivan felt the solid world physically tilt, his meticulously constructed reality suddenly violently shifting on its very axis. His strong hands, still held captive in Aurora's smaller, warm ones, went completely terrifyingly still. Pregnant. A baby. His baby. Images flashed through his mind, unwanted and utterly devastating. His father's cold, unforgiving voice, the stark white funeral flowers, a tiny gravestone he had visited precisely once and sworn never to see again. The price of love. The crushing cost of life. Aurora was intently watching his face, her expression slowly morphing from one of hopeful anticipation into profound confusion, and then into something that looked dangerously close to raw, searing hurt. "Sullivan, please, say something." But he was incapable. The only sound echoing violently in the vast cathedral of his mind was his father's deep, resonant voice, delivered 37 years earlier. Asterisk, your existence cost the life of the only woman I ever loved. Asterisk, what if he wasn't strong enough to escape his fate? What if he was destined, genetically, to repeat that horrific pattern? What if truly loving Aurora, wanting this beautiful, authentic life with her, would ultimately destroy the very thing he was desperately trying to protect? The silence stretched out between them, heavy and terrible, until Aurora's hazel eyes rapidly filled with tears she was too proud, too fundamentally strong, to allow to fall. Had Aurora just given him the greatest, most miraculous gift imaginable? Or had she, entirely unknowingly, just pronounced her own death sentence? 3 agonizing weeks had crawled by since Aurora's seismic announcement, and the elegant Victorian house that had once been a comforting sanctuary now simply echoed with unspoken words and the painful expanse of careful, managed distances. Sullivan had perfected the executive art of being physically present while remaining completely, emotionally absent, a valuable skill that served him well in hostile boardroom negotiations, but was now slowly, methodically poisoning his marriage from the inside out. Aurora stood before the full-length bathroom mirror, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach as she examined her reflection. At 8 weeks pregnant, her body hadn't yet begun to betray the dramatic changes occurring within, but she felt them acutely. The subtle, persistent tenderness in her breasts, the way specific, once pleasant smells now made her profoundly queasy, and the bone-deep, exhaustive fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed capable of curing. She had scheduled her first prenatal appointment for today. Alone. The loud, steady sound of Sullivan's shower running in the master bathroom was a stark reminder of how even their most intimate spaces had devolved into territories they had to carefully navigate around each other. He rose earlier now, always showering while she was still safely asleep in bed, and left for work long before she could possibly suggest they grab a cup of coffee together. Their dinner conversations, which had once flowed with mutual curiosity and natural affection, had now sadly devolved into strained, polite inquiries about each other's days, purely surface-level exchanges between two people grimly learning the exhausting routine of being well-mannered strangers. "Aurora, you okay in there?" Sullivan's voice carried through the solid oak bathroom door, carrying what might have been mistaken for genuine concern if she didn't now know him better. "Fine," she called back, making her voice deliberately steadier than she felt. "Just getting ready for work." She heard his footsteps pause directly outside the door, as if he might momentarily consider saying something more, something real. The weighted silence stretched until his footsteps ultimately retreated toward their vast walk-in closet. Aurora closed her eyes tightly, fighting back the tears that seemed to flow far too easily these days. She had read that increased emotional sensitivity was a common, hormonal occurrence during early pregnancy, but she strongly suspected her current, raw fragility had less to do with surging hormones and far more to do with the growing, icy chasm separating her from the powerful, distant man she had married. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, Sullivan was standing in front of the full-length mirror, meticulously adjusting his tie. He wore a navy blue suit today, a shade that dramatically complemented the steel gray of his eyes, and somehow made his already broad shoulders appear even more formidable. His dark hair was, as always, flawlessly styled. His jaw cleanly shaven, every inch the relentlessly successful businessman who routinely graced the covers of prestigious financial magazines. He looked up the moment she entered, their eyes meeting briefly in the reflection of the glass. For a fleeting instant, Aurora saw something raw and indefinable flicker across his controlled features. Longing, perhaps, or devastating regret. But it vanished so rapidly she immediately feared she might have only imagined it. "I'll be late tonight," he said, turning to face her directly, the mask firmly in place. "Board meeting runs until at least 9. Aurora nodded, pulling a soft, comforting cardigan over her hospital scrubs. "I have an appointment this afternoon anyway." "Appointment?" His voice sharpened instantly, and she saw his hands, still on his cufflinks, momentarily still. "Prenatal appointment. First ultrasound." She kept her tone light and casual, discussing it as if it were a routine dentist visit rather than their first profound glimpse of their unborn child. Sullivan's face went painstakingly blank, an expression she had learned to instantly recognize and now utterly detested over the past few weeks. It was the identical look he reserved for difficult business negotiations, when he needed to hide his inner thoughts behind an impenetrable, calculated mask. Right, of course. He immediately reached for his heavy leather briefcase, the movement decisive and brutally final. Drive safely. That was it. No immediate offer to rearrange his critically important meeting. No hesitant suggestion that they might, perhaps, try to go together. No flicker of curiosity about seeing their baby's very first photograph. Just a polite, emotionless dismissal that registered in Aurora's core like a physical, crippling blow. Aurora stood perfectly still and watched him leave, listened to the powerful engine of his car start and then fade in the driveway, and only then allowed herself to sink heavily onto their marital bed and weep silently. At Seattle Children's Hospital, Aurora moved efficiently through her shift with practiced professionalism. However, her close colleagues couldn't help but notice the profound change in her usually bright, unflappable demeanor. During her abbreviated lunch break, she sat in the brightly lit hospital cafeteria, mechanically pushing a half-eaten sandwich around her plate while staring blankly at the information packet from her obstetrician's office. "You look like someone stole your lunch money," came a familiar, dry voice. Aurora looked up to see Dr. Meredith Foster confidently sliding into the seat across from her. Meredith was Aurora's closest friend at the hospital, a pediatric surgeon known for her sharp, cynical wit, her unapologetic ambition, and possessing enough emotional intelligence to quickly read people like complex medical charts. "Just tired?" Aurora managed, attempting a fragile smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Tired is when you require a second cup of terrible cafeteria coffee. This," Meredith stated firmly, "is something entirely different." Meredith leaned back, studying Aurora with the same intense focus she brought to diagnosing complex, rare cases. "Want to talk about it?" Aurora hesitated. She and Sullivan had vaguely agreed to wait until the end of the first trimester before sharing their news publicly. But the sheer weight of carrying this monumental secret alone, especially when her own husband seemed so grimly determined to ignore its very existence, was swiftly becoming unbearable. "If I tell you something, can you promise, truly promise, to keep it strictly between us? Patient confidentiality extends to friendships, too," Meredith said, her expression instantly growing serious. "What the hell is going on?" "I'm pregnant." Meredith's face instantly lit up with authentic, unrestrained joy before she caught the noticeable lack of enthusiasm in Aurora's posture. "Aurora, that is wonderful news, isn't it?" "It should be." Aurora's voice cracked slightly, betraying her. "Sullivan's not handling it well. Actually, that's a colossal understatement. He's actively pretending it simply isn't happening." "What do you mean?" Aurora found herself instantly pouring out the whole agonizing story. Sullivan's paralyzed reaction to her announcement, the excruciating weeks of careful, artificial distance, the way he seemed to physically recoil whenever she tried to introduce any topic related to the baby. Meredith listened without a single interruption, her surgeon's training evident in the way she clinically absorbed every piece of information before formulating an analysis. "Has he offered any explanation as to why he's reacting this way?" "He won't talk about it. He won't talk about anything real anymore." Aurora wiped her eyes quickly with her napkin. "I feel like I'm married to a complete stranger. A very polite, very distant stranger who just happens to share my bed. Pregnancy can certainly bring up unexpected, deep-seated issues for both partners," Meredith cautioned carefully. "Sometimes overwhelming fear simply manifests as extreme withdrawal. Have you even considered couples counseling?" Aurora laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I can't even successfully get him to discuss what we're having for dinner, let alone our deepest, darkest fears and feelings." "Then maybe," Meredith concluded, "it's time to stop letting him set the terms of this painful conversation." That afternoon, Aurora sat alone in the dimly lit ultrasound room. Her scrub top was lifted to expose her belly while the technician applied the cold, sticky gel to her skin. The wand moved across her abdomen, and suddenly the quiet room filled with an electric sound that made Aurora's heart physically skip a beat. A rapid, rhythmic whooshing that could only be one magnificent thing. "There's your baby," the technician announced, pointing to a small, distinct bean-shaped form pulsing on the monitor. "Everything looks perfectly healthy. Would you like some pictures?" Aurora stared at the screen through tear-blurred eyes. Seeing her child for the very first time, the baby was tiny, impossibly small, but undeniably intensely real. She could clearly make out the delicate curve of the head, the beginning formations of limbs. Asterisk her baby. Their baby. "Yes. Please," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She drove home with the precious ultrasound photos tucked safely in her purse and a digital recording of the heartbeat saved on her phone, feeling an overwhelming combination of elation and profound heartbreak. This moment should have been a sacred, shared experience with Sullivan. He should have been gripping her hand, marveling openly at the miracle rapidly growing inside her, discussing cribs and names and the vibrant future they were supposed to be building together. Instead, she was celebrating this life-altering milestone completely alone. Sullivan's sleek car was already in the driveway when she arrived home, which instantly surprised her given his earlier claim of a late, extended meeting. She found him retreated into his study, still wearing his suit but with his tie aggressively loosened, staring blankly out the window with a heavy tumbler of amber whiskey grasped firmly in his hand. "You're home early," she said softly from the doorway. He turned, and she caught a glimpse of something raw and exposed in his expression before he managed, expertly, to mask it completely. Meeting ended sooner than expected. Aurora took a careful step into the room, pulling the delicate ultrasound photos from her purse. "I thought you might want to see these." Sullivan's eyes dropped instantly to the stark black and white images in her hand, and she watched his face go pale, almost ghostly. For one terrifying moment, she thought he might finally reach for them, might break his silence and ask questions, might show some definitive sign that he cared about the life they had collaboratively created. Instead, he carefully set down his drink and stood up, his posture rigid. "I'm going for a run." He left the room. He left the house. He left her standing there, holding definitive proof of their miracle in her hands, and she felt a painful sheet of ice rapidly forming in her chest where warmth used to reside. As Aurora watched him jog rapidly down their tree-lined street through the study window, she realized with a chilling clarity that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she had completely stopped believing in their idyllic love story. The man who had once made her feel like the sole center of his demanding universe now treated her like an inconvenient, difficult problem to be silently managed. She touched her stomach protectively, making a fierce, silent promise to the tiny life flourishing inside her. Even if their father couldn't find the necessary courage to love them, she would love them exponentially, enough for both parents combined. But as she deliberately placed the ultrasound photos prominently on Sullivan's immense desk, exactly where he couldn't possibly ignore them, Aurora wondered how much rejection one human heart could realistically endure before it simply stopped trying to find its painful way back to love. Sullivan's morning runs had swiftly morphed into a rigid ritual of avoidance, each hard stride carrying him further away from the house that had once been a comforting home and deeper into a past he had spent decades trying relentlessly to outrun. The damp Seattle streets blurred past him as his feet pounded against the pavement in a frantic, demanding rhythm. A rhythm that matched his racing, panicky heart, not from physical exertion, but from the constant, corrosive anxiety that had become his unwelcome companion. 9 weeks pregnant. Aurora was 9 weeks pregnant, and every single day that passed without his acknowledgement of that biological fact felt like another solid nail driven deep into the coffin of their fracturing marriage. He knew, intellectually, that he was failing her, failing them both catastrophically. But the alternative, facing his deeply buried demons head-on, seemed infinitely more terrifying than the prospect of potentially losing everything he had carefully built with her. As he rounded the final corner toward home, Sullivan's phone buzzed aggressively with an incoming text message. He slowed his jog, then stopped completely, gasping for air, when he saw the sender's name. Richard Vane. "Board meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late." That. Sullivan stared at the curt message, his breathing still heavy from his physical run, but now for entirely different, more dangerous reasons. His father rarely contacted him directly about vain aerospace business. Their infrequent interactions were always meticulously choreographed through assistants and formal, structured meetings. A personal, direct text could only signify one terrible thing. Richard had heard a disturbing rumor he vehemently disliked. The cheerful Victorian house came into view, its bright yellow exterior and the inviting wraparound porch offering a stark, painful contrast to the heavy dread settling like lead in Sullivan's chest. Through the kitchen window, he could clearly see Aurora moving about, likely preparing a quick breakfast before her hospital shift began. She wore her hair in a simple ponytail today, and even from this distance, he could observe the fluid, graceful way she moved, the unconscious elegance that had first captured his full attention at that charity gala 3 years prior. He'd been so arrogantly confident back then, so utterly certain that his immense wealth and secure status could somehow protect him from the specific, devastating pain his father had warned him about. Aurora had felt like definitive proof that he could successfully rewrite the tragic Vane family narrative, that love didn't have to ultimately end in tragedy and destruction. Now, watching her through the glass pane of the window, he felt nothing but a hollow, crushing sense of cowardice. Sullivan entered quietly through the back door, finding Aurora standing at the stove, expertly scrambling eggs. She glanced up immediately when he walked in, and he caught the brief, fleeting flash of hope in her eyes before she instantly masked it with that practiced, careful neutrality. She had been doing that agonizing choreography more often lately, hoping desperately for connection and then quickly protecting herself when he inevitably disappointed her. "Good run?" she asked, her tone politely conversational, almost distant. "Fine." He grabbed a bottle of cold water from the refrigerator, hyper-aware of the painful, massive space between them in the very center of their own kitchen. "I'll need to leave early today. Meeting with my father." Aurora's hand stilled abruptly on the spatula handle. In 3 years of marriage, Sullivan could count on exactly one finger the number of times he had voluntarily met with Richard Vane. Their relationship was professional at best, openly hostile at worst. "Is everything okay? Business?" "Business," Sullivan confirmed, which wasn't technically a lie, but felt like a soul-destroying one anyway. Aurora nodded slowly, turning back to the eggs. "I made enough for 2 if you want some." The offer was simple, profoundly domestic, the exact kind of small, routine kindness that had originally defined their deep relationship before everything became so impossibly complicated. Sullivan found himself nodding automatically before his conscious brain could remind him of all the rational reasons why sitting down for a shared breakfast was a fundamentally bad idea. They ate in relative silence, but it was not the comfortable, easy quiet they had once shared. This silence was careful, visibly constructed, unbearably full of all the unspoken things neither of them was brave enough to say. Aurora picked listlessly at her eggs, her usual healthy appetite noticeably diminished by the morning sickness she hadn't explicitly mentioned, but which he had noticed anyway. She'd been noticeably pale in the mornings, moving with a slight slowness, often reaching discreetly for dry crackers before even getting out of bed. He noticed everything about her. That was precisely the crippling problem. "The Hendersons called yesterday," Aurora said eventually, breaking the tension, "about dinner this weekend." The Hendersons were their core couple friends, Mark and Lisa, married for a solid decade with twin daughters Aurora absolutely adored. They'd had standing dinner plans once a month until recently, when Sullivan had started finding increasingly elaborate excuses to cancel. "I'll be busy this weekend." "You don't even know what weekend I'm talking about." Sullivan looked up from his plate to find Aurora watching him with a complex expression he couldn't accurately decipher. There was undeniable hurt there, yes, but also something significantly sharper, something that looked distinctly like the nascent stages of true anger. "Aurora, do you know what Lisa asked me yesterday?" Aurora continued, her voice steady now but rapidly gaining strength. "She wanted to know if we were having marriage problems. Apparently, you've successfully become the invisible man in our entire social circle." Sullivan felt a wave of heat surge in his chest. Not quite anger, but something terrifyingly close to it. "I've been busy with work. You've been busy avoiding me." The words hung between them like a sharp, undeniable accusation. Sullivan slowly set down his fork, his entire appetite suddenly, completely gone, and met his wife's eyes directly for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The weeks had stretched into a terrifying void of silence and missed connection. That's not it's exactly what you've been doing. Aurora's voice remained unervingly calm, a quiet pool hiding a turbulent current, but Sullivan noticed the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands where they rested on the polished wood of the table. For 9 weeks, Sullivan, you've been treating me like a complete stranger, like some mandatory acquaintance you're forced to be minimally polite to, but whose existence you actively wish to avoid. And I want to know why. Sullivan felt the familiar, cold panic tightening its grip in his throat, a suffocating knot of dread. It was the same overwhelming sensation that had consumed him the night Aurora had announced her pregnancy. The desperate, visceral need to bolt, to escape the confines of this kitchen, to put maximum physical and emotional distance between himself and this conversation. The one conversation that he knew had the power to shatter his meticulously constructed world. I need to shower before my meeting. He pushed himself back from the table with a sudden, jerky movement, but Aurora's quiet voice, laced now with a steel he hadn't heard before, stopped him dead before he could even reach the kitchen door. I won't do this much longer, Sullivan. He turned back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Something in her tone, a mixture of profound exhaustion and absolute demand, compelled his attention. Do what? Pretend that this agonizing emotional vacuum is normal. Pretend that it's acceptable for my husband to act as if I am utterly non-existent, merely because I am carrying his child. Aurora's voice cracked slightly, the sound brittle and fragile on those final words. Yet she never once broke eye contact. I love you. I've loved you since the night we met, and I genuinely thought you loved me, too. But this isn't love, Sullivan. This is thinly veiled tolerance. And I deserve something infinitely better than that. Sullivan felt the solid world around him suddenly list and tilt. The same dizzying, terrifying vertigo he'd experienced 9 weeks ago, when the word pregnant had dropped like a bombshell. But this time, the fear wasn't solely about the abstract, historical terror of losing Aurora to childbirth. It was the immediate, present dread of losing her due to his own profound, gutless cowardice. Aurora, I have an appointment with Dr. Martinez next week to talk about our marriage. She stood up, her movements deliberate and final, clearing away their barely touched breakfast plates. I think you should come with me. I don't need therapy. We need therapy. There's a crucial, life-altering difference. Sullivan watched her glide around their expansive, gleaming kitchen with a focused, determined efficiency, cleaning up their uncomfortable conversation along with their unwanted breakfast dishes. He desperately wanted to tell her that he loved her more fiercely than he loved his own miserable life. He wanted to confess everything, to explain the ghost of his mother, the venomous legacy of his father's poison, the paralyzing terror that kept him rigid and wide-eyed in the dark, imagining a cold world without her radiant presence in it. Instead, locked in his old, familiar silence, he said absolutely nothing. 45 minutes later, Sullivan sat stiffly in the reception area outside his father's imposing corner office on the 50th floor of Vane Aerospace headquarters. The panoramic view from this vantage point was even more ridiculously impressive and sweeping than the one from his own executive office, a conscious, deliberate reminder of the relentless hierarchy that Richard Vane had never, for a single moment, been subtle about reinforcing. He'll see you now, Richard's personal assistant announced, her voice carrying the trademark crisp, emotionless professionalism that everyone who orbited his father eventually seemed to adopt like an infectious disease. Richard Vane sat enthroned behind a custom-made mahogany desk that truly could have functioned as a small aircraft carrier. His steel-gray hair immaculately styled despite his 73 years. He had aged unervingly well, maintaining that kind of severe, austere elegance that effortlessly intimidated seasoned business rivals, government officials, and board members alike. But Sullivan, having decades of practice, saw the deeper reality that others missed. The fine, permanent lines etched around his father's mouth that spoke not of laughter or worry, but of decades of carefully controlled, highly volatile bitterness. You look tired, Sullivan, Richard stated, bypassing any preamble or greeting. Hello to you too, Dad. Don't be flippant. Richard leaned back slightly in his massive leather chair, studying Sullivan with the same cold, calculating gaze that had established and maintained his ruthless legend in the aerospace industry for 4 decades. I had an interesting conversation with Margaret Foster yesterday. Sullivan's blood instantly chilled in his veins. Margaret Foster was a longtime member of the hospital board and, more dangerously, a close family friend of the Hendersons. If she knew about Aurora's pregnancy, she mentioned that your wife has been seen frequently at the obstetrics clinic. Congratulations seemed to be in order. The word congratulations, coming from Richard's lips, sounded less like a blessing and more like a carefully spat curse. Sullivan remained perfectly silent, adopting his childhood coping mechanism, knowing with absolute certainty that anything he offered would be immediately documented and weaponized against him. You know, Richard continued, his voice adopting that deceptively conversational, reflective tone that Sullivan had learned always preceded his most brutal and devastating attacks. I was about your age when I made precisely the same mistake. Marriage isn't a mistake, Dad. Marriage is a legal contract. Having children is a mistake. Richard rose to his feet, moving slowly and purposefully toward the wall of seamless windows that offered a dizzying panorama of the city far below. I loved your mother, Sullivan, more deeply than you will ever begin to understand. She was brilliant. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She was full of life and limitless potential. And having you killed her. Sullivan felt the familiar, nauseating sick twist in his stomach, the same physical manifestation of guilt that had haunted him since childhood. That wasn't my fault, Richard. Wasn't it? Richard turned back to face him, the sun framing his silhouette in hard edges. She could have had an illustrious career. She could have traveled the world. She could have lived a truly full, uncompromised life. Instead, she chose to have a baby, and that singular choice cost her everything. She wanted children. She wanted you. She wanted you to be happy. There's a difference, Richard. Richard returned to his enormous desk, his expression softening slightly in a way that somehow managed to make his words exponentially more cruel. I'm not telling you this to intentionally hurt you, son. I'm telling you this to save you from repeating the same fatal mistake I made, the one that your wife is now foolishly making. Sullivan shot to his feet abruptly, his hands clenched so tightly into fists at his sides that his knuckles were white and straining. Aurora is not going to die in childbirth. Women have babies every single day without dying. Some do and some don't. Are you truly willing to take that kind of unacceptable, catastrophic risk? The question hung suspended in the air between them, loaded not just with 9 weeks of fear, but with 37 years of concentrated poison and inherited pain. Sullivan had tormented himself by asking the exact same question every night for 9 weeks, and he still had not found an answer that didn't leave him completely terrified and hollowed out. Think about it very carefully, Sullivan, because if you lose her, when you lose her, you will have the rest of your life stretching before you to remember that you had the power to prevent it. Sullivan left his father's office feeling not just tired, but utterly hollowed out from the inside, like a shell waiting to collapse. The descent in the high-speed elevator, dropping 50 floors, felt less like travel and more like a plunge into hell. Each floor marker that flashed past the polished glass seemed to represent another year of his father's corrosive, toxic influence. Another layer of fear and paralyzing doubt that had ultimately shaped him into the kind of damaged man who could completely abandon his wife when she desperately needed him most. As the sprawling city of Seattle unfolded below him through the elevator's glass walls, a maze of power and commerce, Sullivan realized he was standing at a genuine, life-altering crossroads. He could slavishly continue down the sterile path his father had so carefully laid out for him, a predictable life of careful isolation, emotional protection, and solitary achievement. Or he could choose, finally, to believe that love, real, messy, terrifying love, was worth the inevitable risk of profound loss. But as the elevator doors whispered open into the silent, cool garage where his car waited to take him home to Aurora, Sullivan wasn't sure he possessed the fundamental courage required to make the latter choice. Dr. Elena Martinez had been practicing couples therapy for 15 years, A tenure long enough to recognize the undeniable signs of a marriage in existential crisis within the first 10 minutes of a session. As she watched Aurora Vane sit alone in her comfortable office, compulsively checking her phone for the third time in 5 minutes, Elena knew this particular case would be exceptionally challenging. "He's not coming," Aurora finally articulated, her voice carrying a deep, familiar mixture of disappointment and weary resignation that spoke volumes about the critical state of her marriage. "How do you feel about that outcome?" Elena asked softly, settling back into her deep, leather armchair. At 52, Elena possessed the kind of grounded, calm authority that originated from helping hundreds of couples navigate their absolute darkest moments. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back in an austere bun, and her warm, perceptive brown eyes held genuine compassion without even a hint of judgment. Aurora laughed. A short, bitter, joyless sound. "I feel like I'm married to a ghost, Dr. Martinez. He's physically present, he occupies space in the house, but he is completely emotionally absent, and I am exhausted from pretending that this is a normal or sustainable way to live. Tell me about when this started." "The night I told him I was pregnant." Aurora's hand moved unconsciously, protectively, to her abdomen, now showing the slightest, almost invisible curve at 10 weeks gestation. It was like someone simply flipped a switch. "The man I married just vanished." Elena made careful, concise notes while Aurora spoke, her professional training allowing her to expertly read between the lines of what was being overtly said. She had certainly seen this psychological pattern before. Men who retreated dramatically in the face of impending fatherhood, usually due to their own unresolved childhood trauma. But something about Aurora's detailed description suggested deeper, more systemic issues were at play in the Vane family legacy. "Has he given you any comprehensive explanation for his behavior?" "He won't talk about anything remotely real anymore. We discuss the weather, our work schedules, basic household logistics, but anything connected to the baby or our collective future. It's like he is physically incapable of engaging." "Aurora, I have to ask you a difficult question. Do you feel safe in your marriage right now?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise Aurora. "Physically, yes. Sullivan would never, ever hurt me in that way. But emotionally," she trailed off, tears quickly gathering in her eyes and blurring the edges of the room. "I feel like I'm slowly disappearing, like I'm becoming invisible in my own life." Elena nodded, recognizing the profound psychological damage that sustained emotional abandonment could inflict. "What exactly do you want to happen here? If Sullivan were sitting in this room right now, truly listening, what would you need to hear from him?" Aurora remained quiet for a long, heavy moment, considering the question with the careful, analytical attention she usually reserved for complex patient care in her nursing practice. "I would need him to finally tell me why he's pulling away. I would need him to start fighting for us actively instead of passively running from us. And I would need him to decisively choose whether he wants to be a father and a husband, or if he wants to be completely alone. And if he chooses to be alone." The question hung in the quiet, supportive space of the room like a solemn, unavoidable challenge. Aurora straightened in her chair, and Elena observed something vital shift in her expression. A deep, nascent strength that had perhaps been submerged all along, but was now being forcefully summoned to the surface. "Then I'll choose to be strong enough for both me and this baby." Meanwhile, across the bustling, loud city, Sullivan sat isolated in his opulent office, staring blindly at a dense spreadsheet that might as well have been transcribed in ancient Greek, for all the sense it made to him. His legendary ability to concentrate had deteriorated steadily and agonizingly over the past weeks. His renowned focus was now scattered and fragmented by the constant, relentless noise in his own head. His father's venomous voice, Aurora's wounded, unforgettable expression, the sound of a strong, rhythmic heartbeat on an ultrasound that he had actively refused to listen to. His phone buzzed softly with a text message from Aurora. "Session went well. Dr. Martinez has an opening Thursday if you're interested in coming." Sullivan stared down at the simple message, his thumb hovering paralyzed over the keyboard. The rational, calculating part of his brain knew instinctively that he should respond, should at least acknowledge her proactive effort to save their crumbling marriage. But the larger, dominant part of him, the part that had been carefully shaped and poisoned by 37 years of his father's influence, whispered darkly that getting involved would only serve to make everything catastrophically worse. A sharp, precise knock on his office door interrupted his terrifying spiraling thoughts. Margaret entered carrying a formidable stack of red-flagged contracts and wearing the tight, constrained expression she exclusively reserved for delivering deeply unpleasant news. "Mr. Vane, there's been a serious situation at the Henderson Industries account." Sullivan looked up, genuinely grateful for any kind of distraction from his personal failures, no matter how dire the professional consequences. "What kind of situation, Margaret?" "They're threatening to pull out of the defense contract entirely. Apparently, there have been increasing concerns about your reliability and engagement in recent weeks." The words hit Sullivan with the cold, physical force of a blow. Henderson Industries represented a $200 million contract, one of the largest and most critical deals Vane Aerospace had secured that year. More importantly, Mark Henderson was supposed to be a friend, a man who had known Sullivan for years and had never once questioned his professional competence or focus. What exactly did Henderson say, word for word? Margaret consulted her notes, clearly profoundly uncomfortable to be the messenger. "He mentioned that you've been notably absent from social functions. That Mrs. Vane seemed distressed at the last charity event. He's concerned about stability, both personal and professional." Sullivan felt his carefully constructed, compartmentalized world beginning to violently crumble around him. He had worked diligently, obsessively, to keep his private struggles completely separate from his business life, but apparently his desperate efforts at containment had failed spectacularly and publicly. "Schedule a meeting with Henderson tomorrow morning. Sir, I should mention he specifically asked if everything was all right with your marriage." The words were a direct, stinging slap across his face. His marriage was imploding. His vital business relationships were suffering irreparable damage. And he was sitting paralyzed in his office like a coward instead of actively fighting for the life he had built, stone by emotional stone, with Aurora. That evening, Sullivan returned home to find Aurora in the kitchen. But something essential was different. Instead of her usual meticulous attempt to manufacture normalcy through domestic routine, she was methodically packing containers of prepared food into labeled boxes. Her movements were efficient, purposeful, and carried a disturbing sense of finality. "What are you doing?" Aurora didn't even look up from her packing task. "I'm making meals for Mrs. Chun next door. She just got out of the hospital after her surgery." It was such a quintessentially Aurora gesture, instinctively taking care of others, extending that effortless, boundless generosity even while her own world was visibly collapsing around her. Sullivan felt a sharp, acute pang of guilt mixed with a profound sense of admiration for this woman who continued to be everything good and generous in the world while he wallowed destructively in his own paralyzing fears. "That's nice of you. It's what people do for each other when they care." The emphasis on the last two words was subtle, almost passive, but it was absolutely unmistakable. Sullivan stood frozen in the doorway, watching his wife move around their stunning kitchen with the same effortless grace she'd possessed on their wedding day. A day when he had truly believed he was the luckiest man alive. Now he felt like he was watching her through thick glass, perfectly able to see her but tragically unable to reach her. "Aurora, I've been thinking," she interrupted, finally looking at him directly, her eyes grave and tired, "about what our life is going to look like in 7 months. Sullivan felt his heart begin to race wildly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that in less than 7 months we're going to have a baby. A tiny, completely helpless human being who will depend entirely on us for everything. Food, shelter, safety, and love. And I've been wondering what kind of father you are planning to be." The question was delivered without malice, yet it cut deeper into him than any shouted accusation could have. Sullivan had been so utterly focused on his narcissistic fear of losing Aurora that he'd barely considered the child growing inside her as a real, imminent person with real, immediate needs. "Will you be the kind of father who hides in his office when things inevitably get difficult?" Aurora continued, her gaze unwavering. "The kind who treats his family like an unwanted burden to be managed and minimized rather than a blessing to be cherished? Or will you be the kind of man who shows up, consistently, when he's needed?" Sullivan opened his mouth, ready to offer a desperate defense. But Aurora held up her hand, stopping him. Don't answer that right now because frankly, I don't think you know the answer yet. And until you figure it out, I think we both need some physical and emotional space to decide what we really want. The words hit Sullivan like a heavy, unexpected physical blow. Are you leaving me? I'm staying with Meredith for a few days to think clearly, to figure out precisely what I need from this marriage and whether you are genuinely capable of giving it to me. Aurora moved past him toward the stairs, presumably to pack a small bag. Sullivan stood perfectly frozen in the vast kitchen, surrounded by the meticulously prepared containers of food for their elderly neighbor, and realized that while he had been drowning in his paralyzing fears about the future, Aurora had been quietly, powerfully becoming the strong, fiercely independent woman who might no longer need him at all. Aurora, wait. She paused briefly at the bottom of the stairs, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister. But she still didn't turn around to face him. I love you, he managed to choke out, the words feeling both pathetically insufficient and desperately, fundamentally important. I know you do, Aurora replied, her voice soft but filled with an unbearable sadness. But love isn't remotely enough if you're not willing to fight for it. She went upstairs, leaving Sullivan utterly alone with the stark, devastating realization that for the first time in their relationship, Aurora was the one actively walking away, and he had absolutely no idea how to follow her. 20 minutes later, he watched her drive away in her modest Honda Civic, her small overnight bag visible in the back seat, and her ultrasound photos, the ones he'd never had the courage to look at, tucked carefully and safely in her purse. As her taillights disappeared around the distant corner, Sullivan finally understood that he had reached the devastating breaking point Aurora had been gracefully approaching for weeks. He could continue hiding from his deep-seated fears and consequently lose everything that truly mattered to him. Or he could finally find the long-buried courage to face the demons that had been controlling his life since the day he was born. Standing alone in their vast, empty house, surrounded by the profound silence that had become his miserable constant companion, Sullivan realized that losing Aurora permanently was a prospect far more terrifying than any fear his father had ever managed to plant in his mind. But realizing it, he knew, and actually acting on it were two profoundly different things. 3 days without Aurora felt less like 72 hours and more like 3 long, agonizing years. Sullivan moved heavily through their house like a man truly haunted, finding painful traces of her existence everywhere. Her forgotten coffee mug still sat in the sink, her elegant leather bookmark rested on the nightstand, and the faint, sweet scent of her familiar perfume stubbornly lingered on the cool pillowcases. He'd never comprehended how much space one person could occupy until that space became an echoing, oppressive void. He'd barely slept, barely eaten, and his legendary professional composure had cracked so visibly that even Margaret had nervously suggested he take a few days of immediate leave. The meeting with Henderson Industries had been an unmitigated disaster. Sullivan's inability to focus or articulate had cost him not only the $200 million contract but a loyal friendship that had taken years to meticulously build and maintain. "You're not yourself, Sullivan," Mark Henderson had said, his concern palpable despite his professional disappointment. "Whatever is going on at home, you need to fix it, because this version of you isn't someone I can reliably do business with." Now, sitting alone in his study at 10 o'clock on a cold Thursday night, Sullivan stared miserably at his phone screen. Aurora's contact information was open, but the message box remained entirely empty. He'd started typing a dozen different texts over the past 3 days. Apologies, desperate explanations, pleading requests, but he had deleted them all. What could he possibly say that would adequately explain 37 years of fear and manipulation in a single text message? His phone rang suddenly, startling him out of his intense, spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something deep inside him compelled him to answer instantly. Sullivan Vane. "Mr. Vane, this is Dr. Foster from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your wife." Sullivan's blood turned instantly to ice. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's fine, sir, but she collapsed during her shift this afternoon. Dehydration and exhaustion, most likely severely brought on by stress. We're keeping her overnight for observation." The phone slipped from Sullivan's numb fingers, clattering loudly onto his massive desk. Aurora was in the hospital. She was alone, and it was entirely because he'd been too much of a despicable coward to fight for their marriage. And now his wife, his pregnant wife, was physically ill from the stress he had so relentlessly caused. He was in his car within minutes, driving through the dark Seattle night with a reckless desperation that bordered on genuine panic. The hospital corridors felt endless as he frantically searched for Aurora's room, his heart pounding against his ribs with a visceral terror that suddenly made all his previous fears seem laughably insignificant. He found her in room 314, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her, starkly outlined against the crisp white hospital sheets. Her rich auburn hair was spread across the pillow, and even in sleep, her face clearly showed the deep signs of the relentless strain she'd been carrying. And 4-line ran from her arm to a bag of fluids, and monitors beeped softly and steadily in the background. Dr. Meredith Foster, Aurora's closest friend and colleague, sat in the visitor's chair beside the bed, looking up sharply when Sullivan entered. Her expression was highly professional, yet coldly furious, the look of someone who had personally witnessed the collateral damage his emotional absence had inflicted. "She's sleeping," Meredith said quietly, her voice low and tight. "Finally. She's been running entirely on fumes for weeks." Sullivan approached the bed slowly, his hands visibly trembling as he took in Aurora's alarming pale complexion, the distinct dark circles under her eyes that makeup had clearly failed to hide. "The baby? Fine. Aurora's strong, and 11 weeks isn't typically a high-risk period. But stress like this," Meredith stood up, fixing Sullivan with a furious stare that could have cut tempered glass. "This cannot continue, Sullivan." "I know," he whispered. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you've spent the past 11 weeks systematically, painstakingly destroying the woman who loves you, and I am absolutely not going to stand by and watch you finish the job." The words struck Sullivan with devastating, physical force, but he couldn't deny their painful truth. He'd been so profoundly consumed by his fear of losing Aurora that he'd nearly lost her anyway, through his own inexcusable cruelty and neglect. "I never meant to. Intentions don't matter a damn, Sullivan, when the undeniable result is your pregnant wife collapsing from stress and exhaustion." Meredith paused meaningfully at the door. "She's been staying with me because she couldn't bear to be in a house where she felt like a complete stranger. Think about that, Sullivan. Think about what it fundamentally means that your wife would rather sleep on my uncomfortable couch than in the bed she shares with you." After Meredith finally left, Sullivan sank heavily into the chair beside Aurora's bed, finally allowing himself to truly look, without flinching, at the extent of the damage his behavior had done to the woman he claimed to love. She looked fragile in a way that scared him, not just physically, but as if something essential, something foundational to his very self, had been worn away by weeks of unrelenting emotional abandonment. He reached for her hand, moving with the utmost care to avoid the 4-line, and felt a profound jolt of surprise when her fingers instinctively curled around his. Even submerged in sleep, some deeply rooted part of her still reached for him, still trusted him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the careful wall he'd erected around the pain in his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the sound catching and breaking in his throat. "God, Aurora, I am so profoundly sorry." Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his rough voice, confusion clouding her gaze before it settled into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion when she recognized him sitting beside her bed. "Sullivan, how did you?" "Dr. Foster called me." "Aurora, why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well?" She studied his face in the unforgiving dimness of the hospital light, searching, as if trying to decipher a cryptic message hidden there. "When would I have told you? Between your early morning departures and your late-night arrivals? Or perhaps during one of our recent conversations about the weather?" Her words were soft, yet they carried the devastating accuracy of a perfectly aimed arrow. Sullivan felt the crushing weight of every avoided conversation, every deflected question, every single opportunity he'd had to simply be present, and how he had chosen paralyzing fear instead. "I know I've been absent," she finished, her voice flat. "You've been absent from our marriage, absent from our future, absent from our baby's life, and I am tired, Sullivan. I am so tired of carrying this alone. Sullivan looked down at their joined hands, the polished surface of her wedding ring catching the faint light filtering in from the hallway. 3 years ago, he'd placed that ring on her finger, promising to love her in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. He had failed spectacularly at keeping those sacred vows. "Tell me about the baby," he said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the ring. Aurora's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock replacing the weariness. "What? Tell me about our baby. I want to know everything." For a moment, Aurora merely stared at him, trying to gauge if this was another false start, another temporary spike of attention, or a genuine, lasting change. Finally, she spoke, her voice careful but threaded with undeniable hope. "The heartbeat is strong. 160 beats per minute at the last appointment. Dr. Chun says that's perfect." She shifted slightly in the hospital bed, her free hand moving instinctively to cradle her stomach. "I've been having morning sickness, but it's getting better now. And I think I felt movement yesterday. Just a flutter." "You felt the baby move?" Sullivan's voice was barely above a whisper, choked with emotion. "Maybe. Still early, but nurses learn to pay attention to their bodies." Aurora's expression softened slightly, a hint of the woman he loved returning to her eyes. "I wanted to tell you about the flutter, but you seemed so determined not to hear anything about the pregnancy at all." Sullivan felt the immediate, sharp threat of tears, the first tears he'd allowed himself to feel since his mother's funeral 37 years ago. "Aurora, I need to tell you something. About why I can't." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Sullivan took a shaky, desperate breath, knowing this single moment would either save his marriage or demolish it completely. "My mother died giving birth to me, complications during delivery, and my father, he made sure I knew it was my fault." Aurora's eyes filled with sudden tears, but she didn't release his hand. Her grip tightened. "He told me that loving someone enough to have children with them was the most dangerous thing a man could do. That bringing life into the world meant risking the life of the woman you loved most. And I believed him, Aurora. I've believed him my whole life. When you told me you were pregnant, all I could think about was losing you the way he lost her. I know it's irrational. I know women have babies safely every day, but the fear, it paralyzed me." Aurora was quiet for a long, agonizing moment, carefully processing the staggering weight of his lifelong confession. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, yet absolutely firm. "Your father was wrong. I know that. Logically, I know that, but—" "No buts." Aurora squeezed his hand forcefully. "Your father was grieving, and he was consumed by anger. And he took that consuming grief out on a child who had no power to defend himself. That wasn't love, Sullivan. That was emotional abuse." The word struck Sullivan like a staggering revelation. He had never once considered his father's behavior as abuse, only as the harsh, inconvenient truth delivered by a shattered man who had lost everything. But hearing it through Aurora's clear, uncompromising perspective, he began to see the distinct, lifelong pattern of manipulation and blame that had shaped his entire worldview. "I'm afraid I'll lose you," he admitted, his voice cracking with vulnerability. "I'm terrified that wanting this baby, loving this baby, will somehow cost me everything." Aurora shifted in the hospital bed, trying to sit up straighter despite the restraints of the foreline. "Sullivan, look at me." He met her eyes, seeing the resolute, unyielding strength there that had first attracted him from their initial meeting years ago. "I'm not your mother. This isn't 37 years ago, and our love isn't a tragedy waiting to happen. It's a blessing we get to choose every single day." Sullivan felt an internal shift, a subtle but significant loosening of the tight, agonizing knot of fear he'd carried since early childhood. "I don't know how to not be afraid." "Then be afraid, but don't let fear make decisions for you. Don't let it steal our happiness before we've even had a chance to try." They sat in silence for several minutes. The soft, electronic beeping of the hospital monitors provided a steady, clinical rhythm to their first truly honest conversation in months. Sullivan felt completely drained, yet somehow lighter, as if a monumental weight he'd been shouldering alone had finally been shared. "Aurora, I want to come to your next appointment. I want to hear the heartbeat again. I want to see the ultrasound pictures. He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign, yet absolutely necessary. "I want to be the father this baby deserves." Aurora's smile was the first genuine, unrestrained one he'd seen from her in weeks, illuminating her tired face. "The appointment is Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I'll be there." "What about your father? What about the fear?" Sullivan thought about Richard Bain's cold, intimidating office, his calculated cruelty, the subtle poison that had been slowly killing Sullivan's capacity for joy for 37 years. Then he looked at Aurora, brave, beautiful Aurora, who had collapsed from stress because he'd been too cowardly to choose love over his inherited fear. "My father has controlled enough of my life. He is not controlling this." Aurora leaned forward, ignoring the pull of the foreline, and kissed him softly, tenderly. It was the first kiss they'd shared in weeks, and it tasted like fresh forgiveness, like possibility, and like the fragile future they might still be able to painstakingly build together. When they broke apart, Aurora rested her forehead against his. "This doesn't fix everything, Sullivan. We still have work to do, trust to rebuild." "I know, but I want to do that work. I want to fight for us. Then fight. Because I love you, but I won't disappear into your fear anymore. Our baby deserves parents who show up for each other." Sullivan nodded, understanding with absolute clarity that this was his last chance. Not just to save his failing marriage, but to fundamentally become the kind of man who could break the vicious cycle of fear and pain that had defined the Bain family for far too long. As Aurora drifted back to sleep, her hand still securely holding his, Sullivan made a silent, sacred promise to the tiny, developing life inside her. He would not be his father. He would not let fear win. And he would spend every single day for the rest of his life proving that love was stronger than the corrosive ghosts that had haunted him for 37 years. But first, he had to survive Tuesday at 2 o'clock. His first concrete step into a terrifying new future where being a husband and father meant showing up instead of running away. Tuesday arrived with the kind of soft, persistent autumn rain that made Seattle feel both melancholy and hopeful at once. Sullivan stood outside the large, modern obstetrics clinic, his hands shaking slightly as he checked his heavy watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He was early, deliberately, desperately early, because being late would confirm every single doubt Aurora still harbored about his commitment to genuine change. The past 4 days since Aurora's hospitalization had been a careful, tentative dance of rebuilding. She had returned home Sunday evening, but to the guest bedroom, explaining gently that sharing a bed felt too intimate while they worked on reconstructing their foundation. Sullivan had accepted her boundary without protest or argument, understanding that trust, once profoundly broken, required patience and space to repair. He'd spent those days in unfamiliar, obsessive territory, researching pregnancy stages, reading about fetal development, trying to frantically educate himself about the biological process he'd been too afraid to even acknowledge before. The information was both deeply fascinating and utterly terrifying. At 12 weeks, their baby was approximately the size of a plum, with fully formed fingers and toes. The baby could make tiny fists, suck its thumb, and had developed the ability to respond to external stimuli. Their child was real, not an abstract concept or a source of paralyzing fear, but a tiny, developing human being growing safely inside the woman he loved. Through the clinic's large glass doors, Sullivan spotted Aurora in the waiting room, her auburn hair catching the cool fluorescent light as she finished filling out paperwork. She wore a soft, comfortable blue sweater that perfectly complemented her complexion, and her hand rested protectively on her stomach in a gentle gesture he'd noticed her making more frequently lately. The sight of her, his wife, carrying their child, sent a complex, overwhelming mix of emotions through him. Deep love, residual terror, renewed determination, and finally, something that might have been pure, unadulterated joy. He pushed through the doors, and Aurora looked up instantly at the sound. Her expression was carefully neutral, guarded, but he caught a lightning flash of relief in her eyes when she saw him standing there. "You came," she said softly. "I said I would. You've said a lot of things lately. The words weren't cruel, just fiercely honest. But you're here. That's what matters right now. Sullivan took the seat beside her, acutely aware of the other waiting couples. A young pair, who couldn't have been older than 22, held hands tightly while discussing baby names in hushed, excited tones. An older couple, perhaps a second marriage, shared ultrasound photos with obvious, unrestrained joy. Everyone here seemed to belong except perhaps him. Mrs. Bain. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Dr. Chun is ready for you now. Aurora stood, and Sullivan hesitated for a fleeting moment before following. The nurse glanced at him with mild, professional surprise, and Sullivan realized with a fresh wave of shame that Aurora had been attending these monumental appointments completely alone for months. Dr. Chun was a woman in her mid-40s with kind, knowing eyes and an efficient, competent manner that instantly inspired confidence. She looked genuinely pleased to see Sullivan as they entered the examination room. Mr. Bain, wonderful to finally meet you. Aurora speaks of you often. Sullivan felt heat instantly rise in his cheeks, knowing Aurora had been covering for his absence for weeks. Thank you for taking such good care of my wife during my absence. She makes it easy. Aurora is one of my most conscientious patients. Dr. Chun gestured for Aurora to lie back on the examination table. How are you feeling since your hospital stay? Any lingering fatigue or nausea? Much better, Aurora said, though Sullivan noticed she pointedly avoided looking at him when she added, less stress lately, doctor. Dr. Chun began the routine examination, checking Aurora's blood pressure and measuring her gradually growing belly. Sullivan stood awkwardly near the door until Aurora reached out her hand. A silent, powerful invitation he accepted gratefully, moving forward to take her hand in his. Everything looks perfect, Dr. Chun announced brightly. Baby's measuring right on schedule. Are you ready to hear the heartbeat? Sullivan's mouth went instantly dry. The heartbeat. One of the best parts of these appointments, Dr. Chun said, applying a cold, clear gel to a handheld Doppler device, though it might take me a minute to locate the right position. She placed the device on Aurora's stomach and began moving it slowly, methodically. For several seconds, there was nothing but a low, abrasive static. Sullivan found himself holding his breath, gripping Aurora's hand perhaps tighter than was necessary. Then, suddenly, the small room filled with sound. A rapid rhythmic whooshing, like a tiny, frantically beating drum, unmistakably and profoundly alive. There we go, Dr. Chun said with satisfaction. Strong and fast. Exactly what we want to hear. Sullivan felt his knees go suddenly weak. The sound was impossible to ignore, impossible to intellectualize away. This was not theory or fear or abstract possibility. This was his child's heart beating relentlessly inside Aurora's body. Proof of the life they had created together. That's our baby? His voice came out rough, barely controlled, steeped in disbelief. That's your baby? Aurora confirmed, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she watched his shocked face. For several intense minutes, they listened in an odd, suspended silence. Dr. Chun adjusted the device occasionally, but the heartbeat remained fiercely strong and steady, a resonant promise of the future growing between them. Would you like to try? Dr. Chun offered the Doppler to Sullivan. With trembling hands, Sullivan took the cold device and placed it exactly where Dr. Chun indicated. When he found the sound again, their baby's heartbeat, something fundamental shifted inside him. The fear didn't vanish entirely. He knew it would always be there, but it was utterly overwhelmed by something infinitely stronger. Love. I can't believe. He couldn't finish the sentence, too overcome by the torrent of emotion washing over him. Now for the fun part, Dr. Chun said, wheeling over an ultrasound machine. Let's get some pictures. The ultrasound gel was cold against Aurora's skin, but she barely seemed to notice. Sullivan positioned himself where he could clearly see the monitor, his heart now racing with anticipation rather than anxiety for the first time in months. The screen came to life with grainy black and white images that gradually resolved into recognizable shapes. Dr. Chun moved the wand slowly, pointing out different features as they appeared. Here's the head, and there's the spine. Oh, perfect. Baby's moving around quite a bit today. And suddenly, Sullivan could see it all. The delicate profile of their child's face, the tiny arms and legs moving with surprising energy, the rapid flutter of the heart they just heard. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. Is that? Sullivan pointed to a small, distinct protrusion on the screen. Looks like babies sucking their thumb, Dr. Chan said with a warm smile. Very common at this stage. Aurora laughed through her tears, squeezing Sullivan's hand. Our little thumb sucker. The word hit Sullivan with unexpected, monumental force. Not Aurora's pregnancy or Aurora's baby, but ours. A shared responsibility and joy and future that he had been running from for months. Everything looks absolutely perfect, Dr. Chun concluded, printing several crisp ultrasound photos. Baby's growing beautifully, and Aurora's health markers are all excellent. Next appointment is in 4 weeks. We'll do another ultrasound then. And if you want to know the baby's sex, we should be able to tell. After the appointment, Sullivan and Aurora sat in his car in the clinic parking lot. The ultrasound photos were spread between them on the center console, like a delicate, tangible bridge across the chasm his fear had created. Thank you for coming, Aurora said quietly, looking at him fully. Thank you for letting me. They drove home in a comfortable, reflective silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the appointment and what it definitively meant for their future. Sullivan kept glancing at the ultrasound photos on the dashboard, still struggling to fully process the intense, undeniable reality of what he'd seen and heard. At home, Aurora made tea while Sullivan studied the photos spread across the kitchen table. Every detail fascinated him. The perfect, tiny curve of the baby's spine, the miniature feet, the face that somehow already looked like it belonged to both of them. I've been thinking about names, Aurora said, setting a mug in front of him. Names? I know we haven't talked about any of this, but I couldn't help myself. She pulled a small, worn notebook from her purse, pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting. I made lists, traditional names, modern names, family names. Sullivan looked at the lists, seeing names he'd never allowed himself to consider having any relevance to his cold, ordered life. What about family names? Well, Sullivan is obviously a family name for you, and Aurora was my grandmother's name. She paused, studying his face carefully. What was your mother's name? Sullivan felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of his mother, but for the first time, it was accompanied by tentative curiosity rather than just searing pain. Catherine Elizabeth. That's beautiful. Catherine Elizabeth Bain has a lovely sound. She mused. If it's a girl, and if it's a boy? Sullivan thought about it, realizing he'd never dared allow himself to imagine having a son. I don't know. Not Richard. Aurora reached across the table and covered his hand with hers reassuringly. We have time to figure it out. All of it. That evening, Sullivan found himself in his study. But instead of burying himself in work, as he had habitually done for months, he was researching cribs and car seats and everything else he'd rigorously refused to think about before. Aurora appeared in the doorway around 9 o'clock, wearing the soft, cotton pajamas that made her look younger than her 32 years. What are you doing? Learning, Sullivan said, gesturing to his computer screen filled with overwhelming baby gear reviews. Apparently, choosing a car seat is far more complicated than negotiating aerospace contracts. Aurora smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her since her pregnancy announcement. It's overwhelming at first, but we don't need to figure everything out tonight. I want to though. I want to be prepared. I want to be, he struggled for the right, necessary words. I want to be the partner you deserve. The father our baby deserves. Sullivan, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. Present. Such a deceptively simple word, but it encompassed everything he'd catastrophically failed to be for the past 3 months. Sullivan stood up from his desk and walked to where Aurora stood framed in the doorway. I love you, he said, the words carrying more honest, painful weight than they ever had before. And I love our baby. I'm sorry it took me so long to say that. Aurora's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they were happy tears this time, glistening under the hall light. I love you too. Both of you. They stood there for a long moment, not quite touching, yet closer than they had been in months, surrounded by the quiet comfort of their home and the immense, tangible promise of the family they were finally building together. But just as Sullivan reached out for Aurora's hand, his phone rang sharply on the desk. The caller ID displayed his father's number, and Sullivan felt his stomach clench instantly with familiar, cold dread. Richard Bain had an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to intrude at the absolute worst possible moments. "Don't answer it," Aurora said immediately, reading the sudden tension in his expression. "I have to. He'll just keep calling." Sullivan picked up the phone, his voice carefully controlled, neutral. "Hello, Dad." "Sullivan, I heard you were at the hospital the other day. Is Aurora all right?" The question caught Sullivan completely off guard. His father rarely inquired about Aurora's well-being, and never with what sounded like genuine concern. "She's fine, just some dehydration." Good, good." There was a heavy pause. Then Richard's voice took on its familiar, calculating corporate tone. "I also heard you accompanied her to a doctor's appointment today." Sullivan felt Aurora tense rigid beside him. Somehow, his father had already learned about their visit to Dr. Chun, mere hours later. "That's right. I think we need to talk tomorrow morning." "My office." "Dad." "I'm not." "Sullivan, don't be late." The line went dead, leaving Sullivan staring at his silenced phone with a growing, cold sense of foreboding. His father's summons felt deeply ominous, like a dark storm cloud gathering rapidly on the horizon of his fragile, newfound happiness. What did he want? Aurora asked, though her expression suggested she already strongly suspected the answer. "To talk about today. Probably about the baby." Aurora's face went pale, worry instantly returning. "What are you going to tell him?" Sullivan looked down at the ultrasound photos still scattered on his desk, then at Aurora standing in the doorway, her hand protectively covering their child, and felt something solid and unbreakable crystallize inside him. He had made his choice in the clinic today. Now he had to defend it. The truth, that I'm going to be a father, and he has no say in how I handle that. But even as he said the words, Sullivan felt the familiar, chilling tendrils of his father's influence creeping back into his thoughts. Richard Bain had expertly controlled his son's fears for 37 years, and one afternoon of ultrasounds and heartbeats might not be enough to break that entrenched hold completely. Tomorrow's conversation would determine whether Sullivan could finally, definitively break free from his father's emotional poison, or whether Richard would somehow find a way to drag him back into the darkness just when he'd finally begun to see the light. Sullivan stood outside his father's imposing office at exactly 10 o'clock Wednesday morning. The ultrasound photos from yesterday's appointment were tucked safely in his jacket pocket, providing a constant source of quiet strength. He'd looked at them a dozen times since leaving home, each glance strengthening his resolve for the battle ahead. Whatever psychological warfare Richard Bain had planned, it was already obsolete. Sullivan was no longer the shattered adolescent who had spent 37 years willingly absorbing the venom of self-blame for his mother's tragic death. He was now armored, focused, and finally free. "He's waiting for you," Richard's executive assistant murmured, her tone a soft, empathetic warning, suggesting that anyone about to step into Richard's inner sanctum was walking directly into a predator's lair. Richard Bain sat enthroned behind his massive, imposing rosewood desk, a symbol of unchallengeable corporate power. But this time, Sullivan's newly opened eyes noticed the stark, chilling details he had previously missed. The office was breathtakingly sterile, surgically devoid of any human element. No personal photographs, no sentimental trinkets, certainly no pictures of Sullivan's mother, no evidence of shared family memories. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that suggested Richard Bain had ever cared about anything beyond the ruthless pursuit of corporate success and the suffocating maintenance of absolute control. "Sit down, Sullivan." "I'll stand." Richard's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched slightly, a minuscule but potent sign of displeasure at this sudden, jarring deviation from their decades-long script. For 37 years, Sullivan had been the pliable, obedient heir, absorbing his father's pronouncements and accepting his judgment without a breath of protest. The shift in the power dynamic was infinitesimally subtle but devastatingly unmistakable. "As you wish," Richard conceded, leaning back into his chair, his gaze calculating and cold, fixed on Sullivan. "I understand congratulations are in order. You are going to be a father. That's right. And you've decided to embrace this foolish development, despite everything I have painstakingly taught you about the inevitable risks involved." Sullivan felt the familiar, crippling tightness clench in his chest. But now clarity had arrived. He instantly recognized the sensation for what it truly was. Not an objective warning, but deeply ingrained psychological conditioning, 37 years of carefully planted, insidious fears designed solely to keep him isolated, paralyzed, and safely under Richard's malignant influence. "What you taught me," Sullivan stated, his voice steady despite the internal tremor, "was wrong." The four simple words hung in the hyper-pressurized air between them. A direct, devastating challenge that Richard Vane had never, in his entire life, received from his son. For a fraction of a second, something dark and chaotic flickered across the older man's face. Was it genuine surprise, or perhaps a volcanic surge of anger that was instantly and brutally suppressed? "Was it?" Richard countered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Then tell me, Sullivan, what happens if Aurora doesn't survive the birth? If you lose her in that delivery room? That's not going to happen. How can you possibly be so certain? Do you truly believe that love grants immunity to tragedy? Do you think desperately wanting something guarantees a favorable outcome?" Richard abruptly stood up, moving with predatory grace toward the wall of seamless windows that offered a dizzying, arrogant view of the entire Seattle skyline. "Your mother wanted you more than she wanted life itself. She planned for you, prepared for you, loved you before you were even a recognizable shadow. And that love, Sullivan, it killed her." Sullivan felt the old, suffocating pain attempting its violent resurfacing, but this time, he had impenetrable armor against it. Aurora's unwavering love, the powerful echo of their baby's heartbeat, the profound knowledge that he was no longer trapped and alone with those poisonous, fabricated thoughts. "My mother died from complications," Sullivan rebutted, meeting his father's eyes across the expansive office. "Medical complications that had absolutely nothing to do with whether or not she wanted a baby. She died because she made a choice to have a child. Because she prioritized your existence over her own survival," Richard corrected, his voice flat, emotionless. "No, she died because sometimes terrible, unavoidable things happen, Dad. And no amount of fear, no amount of control, and certainly no amount of pathetic isolation can ever prevent them." Richard turned fully back to face him, and in that moment, Sullivan perceived a detail he'd never registered before. Not deep grief, nor paternal protective love, but something far more chilling. A dark, unsettling satisfaction at having successfully inoculated Sullivan's mind with his paralyzing poison for so many debilitating years. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, son. A mistake that will cost you everything you now care about. The only mistake I ever made was listening to you for 37 years. Sullivan reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the precious ultrasound photos, laying them pointedly on the cold expanse of Richard's desk. "This is my child, Aurora's and mine, and I am going to love this baby, and I'm going to be the kind of father who shows up, who supports, who doesn't poison their child's mind with manufactured fear and self-blame." Richard glanced down at the photos with an expression that bordered on outright contempt. "Sentimental nonsense." "Love isn't sentimental nonsense," Sullivan shot back. "It's the only damn thing that matters. Love is what killed your mother." "No," Sullivan said, his voice gaining fierce, undeniable strength with every syllable. "What killed my mother was a medical tragedy. What has been killing me for 37 years is you." The accusation struck Richard Vane with the visible, shocking force of a physical blow. For the first time in Sullivan's entire memory, his father looked genuinely stunned. His composure shattered, if only momentarily. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? You've spent my entire life making absolutely sure I felt responsible for her death. Making sure I was too terrified to love anyone the way you claim you loved her. And why? Because if I was happy, if I succeeded in building a family, if I dared to move on with my life, it might prove that tragedy doesn't have to define or destroy everything that comes after. Sullivan stepped closer to his father's desk, feeling decades of suppressed rage and corrosive pain finally finding a strong, clear voice. You didn't keep me isolated to protect me, Dad. You kept me isolated to protect yourself. Because as long as I was as miserable and afraid as you are, you didn't have to confront the devastating possibility that you could have chosen differently. That you could have honored her memory by living fully, instead of by ensuring her son never got the chance to be happy. Richard's face was now starkly pale, but his voice remained frighteningly controlled. You have no concept of what true loss feels like, Sullivan. When you lose Aurora, and you will lose her, then you'll finally understand why I tried to spare you this agonizing pain. If something happens to Aurora, Sullivan replied, his own voice steady and resolute, I'll grieve. I'll be completely devastated. But I'll still be grateful for every single day we had together, every moment of love we shared, every second of our baby's life. Because that's what you do when you genuinely love someone, Richard. You celebrate the precious time you have, instead of destroying it prematurely with fear about the time you might eventually lose. Sullivan picked up the ultrasound photos, refusing to leave them behind in his father's toxic presence. I'm done taking your calls about my personal life, Dad. I'm done letting you poison my marriage with your manufactured fears. And I'm especially done letting you anywhere near my child. Sullivan. Goodbye, Dad. Sullivan strode toward the heavy door, feeling lighter, freer, with every deliberate step. Behind him, he heard his father's voice, sharp and laced with a raw desperation he had never heard before. When she dies in that delivery room, don't come to me for comfort. Don't expect sympathy from the man you just accused of ruining your life. Sullivan paused at the threshold, turning back to see Richard Vane looking, surprisingly smaller, somehow diminished by the acidic bitterness consuming him. When our baby is born healthy, and Aurora recovers beautifully, I won't expect an apology either, because by then, I hope to be far too busy being happy to care what you think about it. The elevator ride down 50 floors felt less like a descent through glass and steel, and more like a journey through time. Past 37 years of paralyzing fear, corrosive guilt, and calculated emotional distance. He was moving inexorably toward a future where love, resilience, and true choice were demonstrably stronger than the malignant ghosts that had haunted the Vane family for far too long. By the time Sullivan reached the marble lobby, his phone was already vibrating fiercely, with text messages from Aurora. How did it go? Are you okay? Come home when you're ready. I love you. Sullivan smiled, a genuine, unburdened expression, as he typed his immediate response. On my way. I have something important to tell you. The long drive home through the familiar, congested labyrinth of Seattle traffic gave Sullivan the necessary time to fully process the magnitude of the encounter. For the first time in his adult life, he had stood up to Richard Vane completely. He hadn't just disagreed with him or cleverly deflected his usual criticisms. He had actively, openly rejected his father's entire cynical worldview and irrevocably chosen a different, brighter path. He found Aurora in what used to be a cluttered storage room, now designated as the nursery. She had apparently spent the entire morning in a flurry of purposeful activity. Boxes were neatly stacked in the hallway outside, and she was standing precisely in the center of the empty, sunlit space, her hands settled firmly on her hips, surveying the room's infinite possibilities. You've been busy, Sullivan observed from the doorway, his own anxiety melting away as he watched her. Aurora spun around, her face momentarily anxious as she quickly searched his expression for damage. How was it with your father? It was, Sullivan paused, deliberately searching for the most fitting word. Final. What do you mean, final? Sullivan walked into the room, imagining the space as it would soon be, filled with the essential furniture and the colorful, joyful paraphernalia their child would need. He envisioned a sturdy crib placed gently by the window, catching the soft morning light. A comfortable rocking chair where Aurora could nurse while he read silly bedtime stories. A safe changing table covered with soft blankets and tiny, impossibly small clothes. I told him the truth, Sullivan explained, the weight lifted from his shoulders palpable. The truth about what his poison has done to me, about how I'm choosing to live my life going forward, about how he will never be allowed to treat our child the way he treated me. Aurora's eyes instantly filled with appreciative tears. What did he say? Exactly what you'd expect. That I'm making a mistake. That you're going to die? That I'll regret choosing love over fear. Sullivan pulled out his phone and showed her a text message that had arrived during his drive home. The predicted counterstrike. Aurora read the stark message aloud. Vane Aerospace board meeting called for Friday morning. Recommendation to remove Sullivan Vane as CEO due to personal instability affecting company performance. She looked up, her expression hardening with fierce protectiveness. He's trying to destroy your career. He's trying to control me the only way he has left, Sullivan confirmed. He took Aurora's hands in his, noticing how the brilliant afternoon light streaming through the nursery window caught the diamond of her wedding ring. But I don't care anymore. We have enough money saved to live comfortably for years. I can start my own company, or we can simply move somewhere completely different. What matters is us. Aurora stared at him, as if truly seeing him clearly for the first time in months of shared turmoil. You'd give up everything you've built? I've already given up everything that truly matters by being afraid to fight for it, Sullivan admitted openly. My career, my father's empty approval, the company legacy. None of that means anything if I lose you and our baby because I was too much of a coward to choose happiness. Aurora took the final step closer to him, close enough that he could feel the radiating warmth of her body, close enough to see the incandescent hope and determination shining in her eyes. What if we don't have to choose? What if we fight for both our family and your career? How? Aurora smiled, and the expression instantly transformed her face from merely pretty to undeniably radiant. By showing everyone that the man who finally stood up to his father this morning is exactly the kind of leader Vane Aerospace desperately needs. By proving that personal growth makes you stronger, not weaker. By absolutely refusing to let him define the narrative. Sullivan felt a sudden, exhilarating rush he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine excitement about the future, completely displacing the habitual dread. You want to take on Richard Vane? I want to take him on with you, she affirmed fiercely. As a team, as partners, as two people who refused to let fear win. They stood together in the empty nursery, surrounded by boundless possibilities, powerful hope, and the growing, certain knowledge that their love was indeed strong enough to overcome whatever formidable challenges lay ahead. Sullivan could almost physically see their future taking shape in the sun-drenched room. Late-night feedings, first smiles, and the 1,000 tiny, irreplaceable moments that would constitute their child's earliest life. There's something else, Sullivan said, remembering the second, less catastrophic text message that had arrived during the drive home. Mark Henderson called. He wants to schedule a meeting to discuss the contract. The one I lost earlier because of everything. Aurora's expression sharpened. The government defense contract? Apparently, word is spreading about my confrontation with my father. Some people are interpreting it as strength rather than instability. Aurora laughed, the sound bright and truly hopeful in the afternoon sunlight. Maybe standing up for your family is exactly the kind of leadership people want to see. Maybe it is. Sullivan's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated slightly before answering, still hypersensitive to unexpected communications after Richard's decades of psychological warfare. Sullivan Vane. Mr. Vane, this is Rebecca Martinez from the Seattle Business Journal. I'm calling about reports of some very significant changes at Vane Aerospace. Would you be available for an interview later this week? Sullivan looked at Aurora, who nodded once, encouragingly. If they were going to fight for their future, they might as well start now, publicly and decisively. I'd be happy to speak with you, Ms. Martinez. But I should mention that any interview would need to include my wife. This story isn't just about business. It's about family. Aurora's smile could have effortlessly powered the entire city grid. As Sullivan scheduled the interview for later that same afternoon, he realized that for the first time in months, he was actively looking forward to tomorrow. Not just surviving it, not just grinding through the hours, but genuinely excited about what it might bring. But deep in the back of his mind, a small, cold voice whispered the familiar truth. Richard Vane had never lost a fight without taking his opponent down with him. And Friday's board meeting was still 3 long, agonizing days away. The highly anticipated Seattle Business Journal interview took place the following day in Sullivan and Aurora's living room. The warm afternoon light created the kind of intimate, genuine setting that television producers endlessly dream about. Rebecca Martinez, a sharp-eyed, seasoned journalist in her early 40s, had arrived with a photographer who was currently capturing candid, yet carefully framed, shots of the couple on their linen couch. Aurora's hand rested protectively on her subtly visible bump at 16 weeks. Sullivan's arm was draped around her shoulders, a gesture that spoke volumes of genuine partnership and mutual reliance. "So, Mr. Vane," Rebecca began, consulting her notes with a professional air. "There are persistent rumors that your father called an emergency board meeting to specifically question your fitness as CEO. Can you comment on that?" Sullivan felt Aurora's hand squeeze his, a silent, powerful reminder that they were performing as a unified, impenetrable front. "It's true that my father has called a board meeting for Friday morning. As for questioning my fitness to lead, I think recent events have actually demonstrated exactly the kind of evolved leadership Vane Aerospace desperately needs right now. Can you elaborate on that specifically?" Sullivan had spent the past 2 days rigorously preparing for this moment, but sitting there with Aurora solidly beside him, the words flowed naturally from conviction rather than from a memorized script. "For too many years, I made critical business decisions based on a corrosive foundation of fear rather than true vision. I instinctively avoided necessary risks, slavishly maintained the status quo, and led from a place of emotional protection rather than bold innovation." He paused, looking directly at Aurora, giving her credit. "My personal growth over the past few weeks, learning to consciously choose love over fear, family over isolation, vulnerability over rigid control, has made me a measurably better leader, not a worse one." Rebecca leaned forward, clearly sensing the profound underlying story. "This personal growth you mention, is it directly connected to your wife's pregnancy and recent medical situation?" Aurora spoke up, her voice calm, resonant, and undeniably confident. "My husband has spent the majority of his adult life carrying deep trauma that wasn't his to bear. Becoming a father has been the inevitable catalyst, forcing him to confront that trauma and deliberately choose a completely different path. Not just for our immediate family, but for the thousands of people who work for him and depend on his stable leadership. Mrs. Vane, you're a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. How has your husband's recent transformation affected your view of his professional capabilities?" Aurora smiled, the genuine expression reaching her eyes in a way that made Sullivan fall instantly and completely in love with her all over again. The man who can fully acknowledge his deepest fears, work relentlessly to overcome them, and choose to publicly fight for his family is exactly the kind of person I would want leading a global company. He's not the same person who used to make decisions from a place of emotional distance. He is engaged, completely present, and willing to take strategic risks for the right, ethical reasons. The photographer captured that exact moment. Aurora's confident, affirming smile, Sullivan's obvious admiration and respect for his wife, the palpable sense of 2 people who had fought valiantly for their relationship and won the first round. "Mr. Vane," Rebecca continued, "there are reports that several key clients have expressed concerns about your recent personal challenges. How do you respond to those specific concerns?" "I respond by pointing unequivocally to our track record," Sullivan said, his voice gaining the necessary strength and conviction. "Vane Aerospace has grown by 30% over the past 3 years. We've secured landmark contracts with NASA, the Defense Department, and private aerospace consortiums around the world. My personal struggles did not diminish those achievements. Frankly, they were accomplished despite my emotional limitations. Imagine what we can achieve now that those limitations are finally being addressed and overcome." Rebecca made rapid notes, clearly impressed by the strategic narrative that was unfolding. "And your father, Richard Vane, built this monolithic company from absolutely nothing. How do you reconcile your progressive vision with his legacy?" This was the precise question Sullivan had been both dreading and preparing for in equal measure. He felt Aurora's hand tighten imperceptibly on his. A final reminder that truth, however uncomfortable, was their strongest weapon. My father is, without question, a brilliant businessman who forged something extraordinary from sheer determination. I respect that achievement immensely. Sullivan paused, choosing his next words with careful precision. But building a company and leading it dynamically into the future require distinctly different skills. My father's approach was perfect for the challenges of his era. The challenges I face and the opportunities ahead of us require a different kind of leadership entirely. What kind of leadership is that? Leadership that values genuine collaboration over rigid, authoritarian control. Leadership that sees emotional intelligence and integrity as a profound strength, not a weakness to be hidden. Leadership that understands that the best, most impactful business decisions emerge from a place of vision and hope, not from paralyzing fear and desperate protection. After the journalists departed, Sullivan and Aurora spent the evening in intense preparation for Friday's decisive board meeting. The expansive dining room table was quickly covered with detailed financial reports, glowing client testimonials, and revolutionary strategic plans that Sullivan had been developing for months, but had never possessed the requisite confidence to present. This projection for the civilian space tourism division is incredible, Aurora commented, studying the dense documents with the same intense attention she brought to a patient's critical medical charts. Why haven't you proposed this before now? Because it's risky. Because it requires significant initial investment with no ironclad guaranteed return. Because my father would have instantly denounced it as reckless and irresponsible. And now, Sullivan looked down at the detailed plans, bold, genuinely innovative ideas that, if executed, could position Vane Aerospace as the undisputed global leader in the next generation of space exploration. Now I think it's exactly the kind of visionary project that will keep us competitive and relevant for the next 50 years. Aurora leaned back in her chair, one hand absently, lovingly rubbing her growing belly. At 13 weeks pregnant, she was finally beginning to show, and the sight filled Sullivan with profound wonder rather than paralyzing dread. You know what I think? What? I think you're going to win on Friday. Not simply because you're fighting against your father, but because you're finally fighting for something bigger than fear. That night, Sullivan lay awake in their bed. Aurora had moved back into their primary bedroom earlier in the week, declaring firmly that separate rooms were no longer necessary, listening to her steady, rhythmic breathing and feeling something he hadn't genuinely experienced in months. A sense of grounded, anticipatory excitement about the future. But his phone buzzed violently at 2:17 a.m. with an incoming text from an unknown number. Check your email. A friend. Sullivan slipped cautiously out of bed and went quietly to his study, his stomach churning with a familiar, metallic taste of anxiety. The email was sent from an anonymous, untraceable account, but the message was chillingly clear. Thought you should know what your father has planned for Friday's meeting. See attachments. Sullivan opened the first attachment and felt his blood instantly turn to ice water. It was a medical file. Aurora's private medical file from her recent hospitalization, including detailed notes about stress-related complications and deep concerns about marital friction affecting patient health. The second attachment was inexplicably worse. A psychological evaluation report Sullivan had never seen, purportedly documenting his emotional instability and inability to handle personal stress without severe professional deterioration. The third attachment made Sullivan's hands shake with helpless, incandescent rage. A proposed restructuring plan that would immediately remove him as CEO, install Richard as interim stabilizing leadership, and include explicit provisions to sell off major, lucrative divisions of the company to key competitors. His father wasn't merely trying to remove him from leadership. He was actively planning to utterly destroy everything Sullivan had meticulously built and sell the remaining pieces to the highest bidder. Sullivan's phone rang instantly, the caller ID displaying his father's direct line. I see you got my message. Richard's voice was unervingly calm, almost pleasantly conversational. You had someone steal Aurora's medical records. Sullivan choked out, his voice tight with fury. I had someone research the pertinent facts that will be presented to the board on Friday. Richard corrected smoothly. Aurora's high-stress hospitalization, your public inability to maintain professional relationships, your recent emotional outbursts. It all paints a clear picture of a man who cannot possibly be trusted with a multi-billion-dollar company. Richard's voice then took on its familiar, sickeningly patronizing tone. I tried to warn you, Sullivan. I tried desperately to save you from this destructive path. But you insisted on choosing emotional sentiment over rational business decisions. Sullivan felt rage building in his chest, but it was a purified, clean anger now, uncomplicated by any lingering guilt or self-doubt. You're not protecting the company, Dad. You're trying to destroy it, rather than let me prove you wrong. I'm preventing a disaster. When Aurora dies in childbirth, and she will die, Sullivan, because that's what happens when vain men fall in love, you'll be completely incapacitated. The company will collapse into chaos. Thousands of jobs will be lost, and decades of work will be destroyed. I'm simply accelerating the inevitable. Aurora isn't going to die. Your mother was younger, statistically healthier than Aurora. She had the absolute best medical care available. And she still died because bearing children is inherently dangerous, and love makes people take unforgivable risks. Sullivan felt something final and immutable crystallize in his mind, erasing all doubt. A clarity that cut through 37 years of pervasive fear and insidious manipulation. You know what I think, Dad? I think you're not afraid Aurora will die in childbirth. I think you're terrified that she won't. Because if she survives this pregnancy, if our baby is born healthy, if I succeed at both true fatherhood and running this company without your suffocating control, then it proves that your entire bitter worldview is a lie. It proves that you could have chosen differently after Mom died, that you could have honored her memory by living fully, by embracing joy instead of dedicating your life to making everyone around you miserable and small. The silence on the other end of the line stretched, heavy and profound, for several seconds. It was the sound of a man who had lost his final argument. Friday morning, Sullivan. Richard's voice finally returned, stripped of its usual veneer of civility, replaced by cold malice. Come prepared to defend yourself because I certainly am. The line went dead, leaving Sullivan alone in his study. The evidence of his father's decades-long betrayal still glowed faintly across his computer screen. But for the first time since this painful, drawn-out battle began, Sullivan felt an overwhelming sense of certainty. He was holding the stronger hand, fortified not by corporate power but by moral truth. Richard Vane had made one crucial, fatal mistake. He'd profoundly underestimated what a man, a son, a husband, a future father, would do to protect his family. Friday morning arrived gray and punishingly cold. Seattle's typical November weather, a sodden chill that seemed to seep into the very foundations of Vane Aerospace, perfectly matched the grim mood settling over the executive boardroom. Sullivan sat at the vast conference table a full 30 minutes early, his presentation materials meticulously organized, but his resolve, his quiet determination, was stronger than any binder or spreadsheet. Aurora had desperately wanted to come for moral support, to be his shield, but he'd convinced her that this particular, deeply personal battle was one he needed to fight and win alone. The 12 board members filed in one by one. These were seasoned executives, powerful individuals who had worked with both Sullivan and his father for years, witnessing the gradual evolution of the company and the slow decay of the Vane family. Their faces were careful masks of neutrality, professional and guarded, but their guarded body language, the way they avoided eye contact, the rigid posture, suggested they knew this meeting would irrevocably determine the company's future leadership and trajectory. Richard Vane entered last, commanding the room with his presence. His silver hair was flawlessly styled. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, making him look every inch the distinguished, ruthless businessman who had built an empire from absolute nothing. He took his accustomed seat at the head of the table with the arrogant confidence of a man who genuinely believed he had never, and would never lose a fight. Thank you all for coming, Richard began, his voice deep, resonant, and carrying the inherent authority that had been intimidating Sullivan for 37 years. We're here to discuss a matter of critical importance to the future of Vane Aerospace. The fitness of our current CEO to continue in his leadership role. Sullivan felt his phone buzz silently in his jacket pocket, a familiar vibration that cut through the tension. He glanced down discreetly. A text from Aurora. Asterisk, I love you. Show them who you really are. Asterisk, as his father began presenting the meticulously documented case against him. Sullivan realized that this moment, this reckoning, had been inevitable since the day Aurora told him she was pregnant. All the lingering fear, all the emotional distance he'd carefully maintained, all the running he'd done from his own potential happiness. It had all been leading to this necessary confrontation between the fearful boy he'd been and the courageous man he was choosing to become. Richard Vane had spent 40 years building his empire on a foundation of control and profound, systemic fear. Sullivan was about to find out if love and courage were strong enough, finally, to tear that entire cold foundation down. The polished mahogany boardroom at Vane Aerospace had witnessed countless corporate battles over the years. Acquisitions, mergers, hostile takeovers, but none quite like this internecine war. 12 of Seattle's most influential business leaders sat around the massive table, their faces composed as they prepared to watch a father attempt to systematically destroy his son's career, or a son finally claim his rightful, earned place as leader. Richard Vane stood at the head of the table, a stack of damning documents, printed emails, medical reports, financial figures. Before him, arranged like weapons in an arsenal he'd been building for weeks. His presentation was methodical, clinical, and utterly devastating. Sullivan's recent, unexplained absences from work, his alleged erratic behavior during critical client meetings, the collapse of several key, sensitive corporate relationships, and, most damagingly of all, Aurora's recent hospitalization due to stress-related complications directly linked to their marriage crisis. The evidence is clear, Richard concluded, his voice resonating with the unquestionable weight of decades of corporate authority. My son, Sullivan, is experiencing a severe personal crisis that has fundamentally compromised his ability to lead this company. His judgment is visibly impaired. His priorities are confused and dangerous, and his emotional instability, his sudden, crippling vulnerability, poses a direct, existential threat to our shareholders, our devoted employees, and our long-standing clients. Sullivan had listened to the entire presentation without interruption, feeling remarkably, almost unnervingly calm despite the slow, public character assassination taking place before his eyes. 3 months ago, these accusations, delivered with such cold precision, would have instantly shattered him. Today, they felt like distant echoes of a fear that no longer had any substantial power over him. Thank you, Richard, said Margaret Foster, the board's senior, most respected member, a woman Sullivan had known since he was a child. Sullivan, you will have equal time now to respond to these serious concerns. Sullivan stood up, his movements deliberate and imbued with a new, quiet confidence. He had prepared extensively for this moment, rehearsing facts and counter-arguments, but as he looked around the table at the familiar, expectant faces, he realized that his response needed to come not from a rehearsed script, but directly from the heart he had only recently rediscovered. Ladies and gentlemen, my father is absolutely right about one thing. I have been going through a personal crisis, but he is profoundly wrong about what that crisis means for my ability to lead this company. Sullivan moved away from the table, opting to address the board members directly, meeting their eyes rather than hiding behind the sterile formality of presentation materials. 3 months ago, my wife told me she was pregnant. Instead of celebrating that life, I panicked. Instead of supporting her with the strength she deserved, I withdrew emotionally. Instead of embracing the future we were trying to build together, I allowed fear, my lifelong, crippling fear, to control every single aspect of my life. He paused, letting the weight of the confession settle, meeting each board member's eyes with unwavering honesty. Fear that had been planted in my mind when I was too young to question it. Fear that has shaped my decision-making, both personal and professional, for 37 years. Margaret Foster leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. What kind of fear, Sullivan? Can you elaborate? The fear that loving someone enough to build a family with them would inevitably lead to tragedy, to devastating, unbearable loss. The fear that taking emotional risks would compromise my professional judgment. that it would make me weak. The fear that showing any vulnerability would render me unfit to lead this corporation, or anything at all. Sullivan turned slightly to face his father directly, seeing a brief, startled flicker across Richard's meticulously composed features. Perhaps surprised that his son was being so open, so direct, about the carefully guarded family secrets. My father taught me that love was weakness, that emotional investment was inherently dangerous, that the safest, most successful way to live was to keep everyone at arm's length and never, ever allow personal feelings to influence professional decisions. Sullivan's voice grew steady and powerful, filling the room. And for years, that philosophy seemed to work. I was successful, I was hyper-focused, I was completely in control. But, prompted James Harrison, the board's skeptical financial expert. But I was also hollow. My professional successes felt empty because I had no one truly close to share them with. My vision for this company was limited because it came from a place of paranoid protection rather than infinite possibility. And my leadership was severely constrained because I was so profoundly afraid of making mistakes that I rarely took the kinds of calculated, ambitious risks that drive real, meaningful innovation. Sullivan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Opening the video presentation Aurora had helped him finalize just the night before. I'd like to show you something now. The wall-mounted screen came to life, not with sterile data, but with vibrant, dynamic images of Vane Aerospace's facilities, its employees, and its achievements over the past 3 years. But these weren't the usual dry corporate promotional materials. These were candid, human shots of real people doing remarkable work, all narrated by Sullivan's own voice explaining, in deeply personal terms, his comprehensive vision for the company's immediate future. The aerospace industry is changing rapidly, Sullivan's recorded voice explained as images of cutting-edge technology and sustainable infrastructure filled the screen. Companies that cling desperately to old models, old fears, old debilitating limitations will be left behind, marginalized. The future belongs to organizations willing to take calculated, brave risks, embrace transformative innovation, and build dedicated teams based on profound mutual trust rather than paralyzing control. The video proceeded to showcase Sullivan's meticulously detailed plans for civilian space tourism, sustainable rocket technology, and unprecedented partnerships with international space agencies, projects he'd been developing in secret for months, but had been too fearful to propose publicly because they represented such significant, fundamental departures from Richard's decades-old, conservative approach. These initiatives represent a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, the recorded Sullivan continued with conviction. But they require leadership that's willing to bet on possibility rather than perpetually hide from risk. They require genuine emotional intelligence to build the complex partnerships necessary for success in this new frontier. And they require the kind of forward-thinking vision that can only come from someone who understands that the greatest achievements in human history have always been driven by love. Love of discovery, love of scientific progress, love of the future we're building for our children. When the video faded to black, the boardroom was enveloped in a stunned silence. Sullivan could see several board members taking rapid notes, their expressions thoughtful, skeptical reserve replaced by consideration. The past 3 months have been the most challenging of my life, Sullivan continued, his voice now carrying the unwavering confidence of a man who had faced his innermost demons and emerged victorious. But they've also been the most transformative. Learning to be a husband who shows up without reservation for his wife. Preparing to be a father who will be actively present for his child. These experiences haven't made me weaker as a leader. They've made me stronger, more focused, and infinitely more capable of inspiring the kind of loyalty and innovation this company absolutely needs to thrive in the modern world. Richard Vane stood up abruptly, slamming his palm on the mahogany table. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Emotional manipulation, sentimental appeals to pity. Sullivan's voice cut across his father's objection with quiet, startling authority. You've had your time to speak, Richard. Now it's mine. The shift in power was subtle, a silent revolution, but utterly unmistakable. For the first time in 37 years, Sullivan had commanded his father to be quiet, and Richard Vane had actually stopped talking, frozen halfway out of his seat. I want to address the specific concerns that have been raised, Sullivan said, turning back to the board members. Yes, I missed several client meetings during my wife's health crisis. Yes, I was distracted and unfocused during an exceptionally difficult period in my marriage. Yes, I made mistakes, significant ones. He paused, letting that honest acknowledgement sink in completely. But I also learned from those mistakes. I sought professional help when I needed it. I fought desperately to save my marriage instead of abandoning it, which was my learned instinct. And I ultimately chose to face my problems head-on rather than run from them. Sullivan's voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of his personal journey. Those aren't the actions of a man who lacks judgment, gentlemen. Those are the actions of a leader who understands that real, enduring strength comes from the ability to grow, adapt, and consistently choose courage over reflexive fear. Margaret Foster glanced around the table, keenly reading the mood of her fellow board members. Sullivan, these proposals you've outlined, they're impressive, visionary even. But they're also quite different from the conservative approach that has made this company successful and stable for decades. How do we know you're not overcompensating for your father's caution by swinging too far in the opposite direction, risking everything? It was a fair, insightful question, and Sullivan had anticipated it perfectly. Because I'm not rejecting everything my father built, Margaret. I am building on it. The foundation he created, the financial stability, the reputation for quality, the indispensable relationships with key clients, those achievements give us the freedom to take calculated risks now. But a foundation isn't the same thing as a limitation. Sullivan moved toward the window, looking out at the glittering Seattle skyline, where other aerospace companies were already quietly working on the very innovations he'd outlined in his presentation. The choice isn't merely between my father's approach and my approach. The choice is between a company that continues to grow and evolve into the future, and a company that becomes so paralyzed by the fear of change that it gets left behind by competitors who aren't burdened by the fear of making mistakes. Richard Vane had remained ominously silent during the final parts of Sullivan's presentation. But now he stood up again, his face pale, tight with controlled, barely contained anger. You want to talk about mistakes? Let's talk about what happens when this high-risk pregnancy ends in tragedy. Let's talk about how you'll function as a leader when you're dealing with the kind of crushing loss that destroys everything you think you know about life. The words hung in the air like a venomous curse, and Sullivan felt every person in the room tense at the calculated cruelty of the attack. But instead of feeling the familiar, twisting knife of fear in his gut, Sullivan felt something entirely different. Pity. Pity for a man so profoundly consumed by his own decades-old pain that he simply could not imagine any other possible outcome for love. Dad, I'm sorry you lost Mom. I'm sorry you've spent 37 years believing that loving her was a mistake instead of the greatest blessing of your life. And I'm truly sorry you've convinced yourself that the only way to honor her memory is by making sure her son never gets to experience the kind of abiding happiness you once shared with her. Sullivan turned back to the board, his voice steady, clear, and absolute. But I refuse to live my life as a monument to fear. My mother wanted a child. She chose to have a family, and the greatest tribute I can pay to her memory is to choose love over the fear that has been poisoning our family for nearly 4 decades. Margaret Foster looked around the table one last time, assessing the consensus, then stood up herself. I think we've heard enough from both parties. The board will need time to deliberate. She was sharply interrupted by the insistent ring of Sullivan's phone. He glanced down at the screen and saw Aurora's number flash. A profound surprise. She knew how critically important this meeting was and would never interrupt unless something was desperately wrong. I'm sorry, Sullivan said, his calm demeanor instantly dissolving. But I need to take this call. Sullivan. Aurora's voice was tight, thin, stretched with pain. Something's wrong. I'm bleeding and I can't. Oh God. It hurts. The phone slipped from Sullivan's suddenly numb fingers, crashing onto the polished floor as pure, catastrophic terror slammed over him. Aurora was in grave trouble. Their baby was in grave trouble. And he was 30 minutes away from the hospital, trapped in a sterile boardroom while his world potentially fell apart. I have to go, Sullivan said, his voice raw, cracking with emotion as he grabbed his jacket. My wife, the baby. He was halfway to the heavy oak door when Richard's voice, cold and laced with dark satisfaction, stopped him dead. And there it is, the precise moment when personal crisis destroys professional responsibility. This is exactly what I've been warning you about. Sullivan turned back to his father, and for a long moment, the boardroom seemed to dissolve completely until it was just the two of them facing each other across 37 years of fear, manipulation, and unbearable pain. You're right, Dad. This is exactly what you warned me about. The moment when the person you love most in the world needs you, and you have to choose between being there for them or protecting yourself from potential, overwhelming pain. Sullivan's voice was steady, despite the tidal wave of terror flooding his system. The difference is, I'm choosing love. He looked around the table one last time at the stunned, silent board members. Ladies and gentlemen, I am profoundly sorry to leave this meeting unfinished. But my wife is in the hospital, potentially losing our baby, and there is absolutely nothing. No contract, no proposal, no power in this building. That matters more than being with her right now. Sullivan headed for the door, then paused one final time, the weight of his decision settling firmly. If that disqualifies me from leading this company, then so be it. But I'd rather lose my entire career than lose my family. And I would rather make that choice honestly today than spend the rest of my life wondering if I was too much of a coward to fight for what truly matters. As Sullivan raced from the boardroom toward the elevator, he could hear Margaret Foster's voice rising slightly behind him. I think we have our answer about what kind of leader Sullivan Vane really is. But Sullivan was already gone, his mind focused on only one desperate, singular thing: getting to Aurora before it was too late. Sullivan's hands shook violently as he gripped the steering wheel, weaving through the dense Seattle traffic with a desperation that bordered on absolute recklessness. His phone was on speaker, resting on the passenger seat. Aurora's labored, terrified breathing filled the car as Dr. Meredith Foster, their obstetrician, tried to keep her calm and breathing while they waited for the ambulance to arrive at the house. The bleeding's getting worse, Aurora gasped, the sound tearing at Sullivan's composure. Meredith, I can't lose this baby. I can't. Oh God. It hurts. You're not going to lose anything, Sullivan said, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation as he ran yet another red light, horns blaring around him. I'm almost there. Just hold on, please. Sir, you need to slow down, came a different voice, calm and professional. The EMT who had arrived first at their house. We're getting her stabilized now. Sullivan skidded the car into the hospital parking garage just as the ambulance pulled into the emergency bay. The next hour passed in a chaotic, agonizing blur of white-coated doctors, incomprehensible medical terminology, urgent consultations, and the kind of existential, paralyzing fear that instantly made his previous corporate anxieties seem utterly insignificant. Aurora was 15 weeks pregnant, past the point where most spontaneous miscarriages occurred, but still agonizing weeks away from viability. As Sullivan paced the sterile hospital corridor, the reality hit him with brutal force. Everything his father had ever predicted was, moment by moment, coming true. The woman he loved was in mortal danger. Their baby might not survive, and he was completely, utterly powerless to fix any of it. Dr. Chun, the specialist on duty, emerged from Aurora's room, her expression carefully professional, guarded. Mr. Vane, we need to talk now. Sullivan's blood turned instantly to ice. The baby? The baby's heart rate is strong, which is encouraging, but Aurora has placental abruption. The placenta is separating prematurely from the uterine wall. We've managed to stop the bleeding for now. But Dr. Chun gently led him to a quiet corner of the hallway, away from the passing nurses. The next few hours are critical. If the bleeding starts again, if the abruption progresses, we may need to deliver the baby immediately to save Aurora's life. Sullivan felt the solid floor tilt violently beneath him. At 15 weeks, immediate delivery would unequivocally mean losing their child, sacrificing the baby to save the mother. But waiting could mean losing Aurora too. What are the odds with placental abruption at this stage? Honestly, Mr. Vane, it's about 50-50 for both of them surviving this without complications. Sullivan sank heavily into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. His father's cruel, prophetic voice echoed deafeningly in his mind. When Aurora dies in childbirth, and she will die, Sullivan, you'll understand why I tried to spare you this pain. For a moment, the suffocating terror threatened to overwhelm him completely. This, he realized, was why his father had spent 37 years in self-imposed emotional isolation. This was why loving someone enough to build a family was so profoundly dangerous. This was why. Mr. Vane. Dr. Chen's voice brought him sharply back to the present, focusing his scattered thoughts. Would you like to see your wife? Sullivan looked up, seeing deep, professional concern in the doctor's eyes. Is she? She's conscious and she's asking for you. Mr. Vane, whatever happens over the next few hours, Aurora needs to feel your strength, not your fear. Sullivan found Aurora propped up in a hospital bed, looking ghostly pale but alert and defiant. And 4-line ran from her arm, and monitors tracked both her vital signs and the distant, fragile sound of their baby's heartbeat. A sound that had filled him with such boundless joy just weeks ago, but now seemed desperately precarious. How did the board meeting go? Aurora asked weakly as he approached her bedside. Sullivan almost laughed at the absurd, terrifying normalcy of the question. Are you seriously asking about work right now? I'm asking about our future, she insisted. Did you show them who you really are? Sullivan took her hand, careful not to disturb the sensitive medical equipment or the foresight. I walked out when you called. Left them sitting there while I ran to be with you. Good, she murmured, a faint smile touching her lips. I probably lost everything, Aurora. My job, the company, the respect of everyone in that room. You chose us, Aurora said softly, her grip strengthening slightly. You chose love over fear. That's what good fathers do, Sullivan. They show up when their family needs them. Before Sullivan could respond, Aurora's face contorted sharply in a spasm of agonizing pain. The monitors began beeping urgently, hysterically, and nurses instantly rushed into the room as fresh, terrifying blood stained the pristine white hospital sheets. Get Dr. Chen, one of the nurses shouted, her voice laced with panic. The next few minutes dissolved into chaos. Medical staff moved with practiced, desperate efficiency while Sullivan was pushed physically to the side, helpless to do anything but watch as his wife and child fought for their lives. Dr. Chen arrived within seconds, quickly assessing the terrifying situation. We need to get her to surgery now. Surgery? Sullivan's voice was barely a desperate whisper. Emergency C-section. The bleeding's too severe to wait. But the baby at 17 weeks. Mr. Vane, if we don't operate immediately, we risk losing them both. They wheeled Aurora swiftly toward the operating room, Sullivan walking quickly alongside her gurney. She was conscious but terribly weak, her face an alabaster shade against the white sheets. Whatever happens, Aurora whispered, gripping his hand with a surprising burst of strength. I want you to know that loving you, building this life with you, was worth every single risk. You're going to be fine, Sullivan insisted, his voice breaking completely. Both of you are going to be fine. And if we're not? Sullivan felt everything his father had taught him about love and loss and the crushing dangers of emotional investment crash over him like a monstrous, breaking wave. But then he looked down into Aurora's eyes. Brave, luminous, beautiful Aurora, who had fought for their marriage when he'd completely given up, who had believed in their love when he had lost all faith. And he knew, with sudden, terrible clarity, exactly what he had to say. If we're not, then I will grieve. I will be broken, shattered. But I'll also be forever grateful for every single moment we had together. Every laugh, every difficult fight, every ordinary Tuesday night when you made dinner and complained about your day at the hospital. Because loving you has been the best thing I have ever done in my life, even if it turns out to be the most painful. Aurora smiled weakly through her tears, the pain etched across her face. Now you sound like the man I married. They reached the double doors of the operating room where Sullivan would have to stop. He slowly released her hand, the warmth of her skin already fading from his memory, and stepped back to wait. The air between them hummed with unspoken words. He leaned in one last time, pressing his lips to her damp forehead, a final ritual. He tasted the metallic sting of tears, the sharp tang of dread, and the familiar, comforting lavender scent of her shampoo. A scent he'd foolishly thought represented the safety of their domestic life. "I love you, Rory," he whispered, the name catching in his throat like grit. Asterisk, come back to me. I love you too, both of you. Asterisk, the heavy, stainless steel doors of the operating theater swung shut with a muffled hiss of compressed air, swallowing Aurora whole. Sullivan was left stranded in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, the silence rushing in to replace the sound of the frantic medical team. There was nothing left to do but measure the endless expanse of the floor with his agonizing pace, pray for a miracle, and face the chilling prophecy his father had spent decades cultivating. The corporate world intruded rudely into his existential crisis. His phone vibrated against his hip, a sharp, unwelcome sound. It was Margaret Foster. The screen displayed the confirmation of his political victory. Asterisk, board voted unanimously. You're still CEO. Some things matter more than business meetings. Asterisk, had this happened yesterday, the message would have been a rush of vindication, a confirmation that he had finally conquered his father's suffocating legacy. Now the news was flat, meaningless. It was background noise in a world that had narrowed down to the sterile walls around him. The only universe that held any relevance lay hidden behind the impenetrable scrub steel of those double doors. Sullivan hit the speed dial for his father, fueled by a desperate, toxic mix of fear and rage. Richard answered on the first ring, his voice razor-sharp, utterly devoid of warmth. "I assume you're calling to tell me I was right," Richard said, the tone perfectly cold, perfectly clinical. "Aurora's in surgery. Emergency C-section. They might not make it." Sullivan choked out the facts, wanting them to slice through his father's smug insulation. The resulting silence on the line was heavy, thick with complicated emotion, or perhaps just shock. Then, "I'm sorry, Sullivan. I truly am." Sullivan's laugh was harsh. "Are you? Or are you relieved that your predictions are finally coming true? That the danger you warned me about is finally validating your isolation? You think I wanted this calamity? You think I wished this tragedy upon my son? I think you've been so utterly invested in the narrative of being right about the dangers of love, the inevitable ruin it brings, that you deliberately forgot how to hope you were wrong. You invested everything in fear, Richard." On the other side of the connection, Sullivan heard his father exhale a shuddering, shaky breath. A raw sound. "When your mother died, I wanted to die too. The world went gray. The only thing that kept me functional was ensuring you understood how catastrophic, how utterly dangerous love could be. I thought if I could immunize you against that specific kind of agonizing pain. You thought you were saving me. But, Dad, the profound, crippling pain you were trying to shield me from? I've been living with it for 37 years anyway. You just made absolutely sure I was too terrified to even attempt experiencing the transcendent joy that makes that risk worthwhile. You made me afraid to live. And if Aurora doesn't survive this? If you lose them both?" Sullivan looked past the phone, staring blankly at the small, opaque window in the operating room door, where he could just make out the fleeting shadows of medical staff moving with desperate, frantic speed. His family was fighting for their lives right there. "Then I will grieve them. The loss will shatter me. But I absolutely will not regret loving them. I won't spend the rest of my life bitter and desiccated and afraid, trapped in a mausoleum of caution. And I definitely won't pass that poison of isolation and fear onto anyone else. Do you understand, Richard? The cycle ends with me." The 2 hours that followed stretched into an eternity defined by the sterile click of his own shoes on the linoleum. When the operating room door finally opened, Dr. Chun stepped out, still fully encased in her surgical scrubs, mask lowered around her neck. Her face was deliberately, carefully neutral, a blank professional canvas giving away absolutely nothing of the battle fought within. "Mr. Vane." Sullivan's heart momentarily seized, a physical, painful halt. He couldn't force the question out. Asterisk, "Are they?" Dr. Chun took a deep, stabilizing breath. "Your wife is stable. The surgery was successful. We were able to definitively stop the bleeding and repair the placental separation. She's gonna be fine, Sullivan. The world tilted back onto its axis. Sullivan's knees buckled. He had to lean heavily against the wall as a wave of pure, disorienting relief washed over him, leaving him momentarily senseless. And the baby? Dr. Chun finally permitted herself a genuine smile, the first expression of unreserved happiness Sullivan had witnessed on her face all day. It was a sunburst. Your son is currently in the NICU. He's obviously quite small, a micropreemie, but his lungs are developing remarkably well, and his vital signs are strong. It is going to be a long, challenging road, likely 2 to 3 months in the hospital, managing his growth and development. But babies born at this gestational stage now have excellent survival rates with the proper level of intensive care. My son. Your son, she confirmed warmly. Would you like to meet him now? The neonatal intensive care unit was a hushed, dimly lit labyrinth of beeping monitors, pulsing lights, and humming incubators. It was a battlefield for the smallest combatants, premature infants fighting their initial, most critical battles, surrounded by the most advanced, life-sustaining medical technology ever developed. Dr. Chun guided Sullivan to a quiet corner, near a large window where the daylight filtered softly. Inside a high-tech incubator lay the smallest human being Sullivan had ever imagined. A tiny, translucent entity connected to an intricate web of tubes and wires that looked grotesquely large, utterly disproportionate to his fragile, delicate body. He weighs just over a pound, Dr. Chun explained quietly, keeping her voice low. But he is breathing spontaneously, mostly on his own, which is nothing short of remarkable for a baby born at this gestational age. Sullivan stared, unblinking, into the incubator glass. Asterisk his son. Asterisk he struggled to integrate this fragile, determined little fighter, this undeniable reality, with the terrifying, abstract concept of baby he had spent months actively avoiding and fearing. The fragility was overwhelming. As he watched, one of the baby's impossibly tiny fingers twitched, a minuscule gesture of life and determination. The sight bypassed Sullivan's conscious defenses entirely, and the words tumbled out, involuntary and genuine. "Hi there," he whispered, leaning close to the clear plastic shield. "Or I'm your dad. I'm so sorry it took me this long to finally be excited to meet you." As if recognizing the sincerity in the voice, the baby's eyelids fluttered open slightly, not a full awakening, but a definite, purposeful glimpse of dark, newborn eyes. "He can hear you," Dr. Chun murmured, a smile softening her features again. Premature babies often respond remarkably well to the reassuring, familiar sound of their parents' voices. It's comforting. Sullivan stayed fixed to that spot for the next hour, pouring out a rambling monologue to his son about everything and nothing. He told the little fighter about the old Victorian house they shared, with its expansive wraparound porch, the nursery Aurora had started preparing with its half-finished mural, and finally the intricate aerospace projects he was developing, the very missions that would shape a brighter future for the next generation, his generation. The man who had been obsessed with control was now utterly focused on this tiny, uncontrollable life. When he eventually pulled himself away to see Aurora, she was awake, floating in the pleasant, cottony haze of residual anesthesia. Her eyes were unfocused, but full of worried question. "How's our baby?" she whispered, her voice fragile. "Perfect," Sullivan said, and he meant it completely, irrevocably. "Small, unbelievably small, but utterly perfect. And he has your incredibly stubborn chin." Aurora tried to laugh, a sound that quickly dissolved into a pained wince from the fresh incision. "What are we going to call him?" Sullivan had been turning the question over and over during his quiet vigil in the NICU, the name solidifying as he watched the monitor screen trace his son's heartbeats. "What do you think about James? After your grandfather James Vane." Aurora took a moment, considering the gravity of the legacy, then her smile widened, radiant despite the pain. "I like it. James Sullivan Vane. Perfect." They settled back into a silence that felt not empty, but profoundly comfortable. Both were physically and emotionally spent, yet simultaneously suffused with the singular, piercing joy that only arrives after facing and surviving the absolute worst imaginable fear. Sullivan's phone kept buzzing incessantly, messages flooding in from board members, high-profile clients, and friends who had somehow heard about Aurora's emergency. He ignored the screen entirely. The corporate world had lost its claim on him. "I was so scared," Rory admitted, her voice trembling slightly, finally breaking the silence. "So was I," he confessed, tightening his grip on her hand. "More terrifyingly scared than I have ever been in my entire life." Aurora looked at him, her eyes wise and knowing. "But you stayed. You chose to be here, truly present, instead of retreating to protect yourself from the raw possibility of total loss. That's everything." Sullivan squeezed her hand in response, his thoughts drifting involuntarily to his father. Sitting alone in his immaculately sterile, high-rise office, surrounded by the towering edifice of the success he had spent a lifetime building, yet utterly isolated from any genuine human connection, any real joy. "I finally, completely figured out what my mother would have truly wanted," Sullivan said, the revelation sharp and clear. "Not for her son to waste his life paralyzed by the fear of loving someone with the intensity my father loved her. She would have wanted me to honor her memory not through caution, but through courage, by choosing love over crippling fear, and by successfully building the strong, joyful family she ultimately died bringing into the world." Aurora squeezed his hand in silent affirmation. "She would have loved James," she whispered, "and she would have been fiercely proud of the man you are now. She would have loved you." 3 days later, Sullivan walked into Richard Vaint's executive suite, a monument to power overlooking the Seattle skyline, for what he inherently knew would be their final professional meeting. Richard looked suddenly, profoundly older, diminished not just by age but by the crushing weight of his own accumulated bitterness and the undeniable knowledge that his son had, irrevocably, chosen a path separate from his own. "The baby survived," Richard stated flatly, the sentence delivered as a regrettable conclusion, not a question. "James is doing well. Aurora is recovering beautifully. We'll all be going home in a few weeks," Sullivan replied, his voice calm and firm, holding no trace of the desperation his father was used to hearing. Richard gave a curt, stiff nod, his gaze fixed distantly on the iconic Space Needle piercing the sky. "I suppose you think this proves I was wrong about everything. I think it proves that love, in all its terrifying reality, is always a risk profoundly worth taking." Sullivan reached into his coat and placed a single, crisp envelope squarely in the center of Richard's polished mahogany desk. His formal resignation from Vane Aerospace, effective immediately. "What's this?" Richard demanded, his composure finally fracturing. "I'm starting my own company. The innovative aerospace solutions I presented to the board last week, the ones you dismissed as impractical, have already secured competitive funding from 3 different, aggressive investment groups. And several of our best, most forward-thinking engineers are coming with me." Richard's face went alarmingly pale, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You're destroying everything I built." "I'm building something entirely new," Sullivan corrected him gently. "Something fundamentally based on vision instead of fear, collaboration instead of crushing control." Sullivan turned deliberately toward the imposing door, then paused, his hand on the brass handle. "You are welcome to be part of James's life, Dad. But only if you can manage to figure out how to choose love over your desperate, lifelong need to be right about absolutely everything." As Sullivan stepped out of the office and the elevator doors slid shut behind him, sealing off his past, he felt a sudden, exhilarating lightness, a weight lifted that he hadn't realized he was carrying. Richard Vane, the powerful magnate who had manipulated and controlled every facet of his son's life through engineered fear, now appeared utterly small, distant, and completely irrelevant. He was powerless to influence the expansive, joyful future Sullivan was now consciously and deliberately building with Aurora and their son. That evening, in the tranquil, hushed glow of the NICU, Sullivan sat reading to James. The book was a complicated text on advanced aerospace engineering, and Aurora was comfortably dozing in the padded chair beside him, exhausted but content. James, their microfighter, was surprising the medical staff daily, gaining small, measurable amounts of weight, a testament to his innate resilience and fierce determination. "Do you know what I think, little man?" Sullivan murmured softly to the sleeping infant. I think you're going to be the kind of person who instinctively chooses courage over soft comfort, fierce love over guaranteed safety, and open possibility over suffocating protection. And I promise you, your mother and I will be right here to support you every single step of the way." As if recognizing the commitment, James's eyes blinked open, seeming to focus clearly on Sullivan's face for the very first time. In that moment of profound, simple recognition and unadulterated trust radiating from his son, Sullivan understood he had finally achieved transformation. He had become the man Aurora had always believed he was capable of being, the man his mother had tragically died hoping he would become. He was the man who chose love over fear, without counting the terrifying cost. 2 years evaporated, filled with the loud, joyful sound of toddler laughter echoing across the wide, wraparound porch of their Victorian home in Queen Anne. A 2-year-old James Vane was currently chasing a cloud of soap bubbles with the single-minded, determined focus that had characterized him since his dramatic, early entrance into the world. At nearly 3 feet tall and 30 pounds of pure, vibrating energy, he showed zero signs of his premature arrival, except perhaps an extra, stubborn dose of the resilience that had powered him through those first critical months in the NICU. "Daddy, more bubbles," James demanded imperiously, his dark hair, so like Sullivan's, curling delightfully at the edges from the mild Seattle summer humidity. His eyes were Aurora's hazel, bright with mischief and an insatiable curiosity. Sullivan sat contentedly on the porch steps, the plastic tub of bubble solution balanced precariously on his knee, watching his son with the kind of absorbing wonder that still caught him off guard sometimes. 2 years of focused fatherhood had fundamentally transformed him in ways he could not have imagined during those long, dark months when institutional fear had been the central ruler of his life. "Okay, buddy, just a few more. But then it's nap time," Sullivan said, dipping the oversized bubble wand and creating a shimmering stream of iridescent spheres that soared upward to catch the golden afternoon sunlight. James squealed with total delight and launched himself after the bubbles, his small legs pumping. His coordination was still adorably imperfect, but his enthusiasm was absolutely unlimited. Watching the pure, unadulterated joy in his movements, Sullivan remembered the fragile fighter in the NICU incubator, connected to machines that had seemed impossibly large for his tiny, embryonic body. The doctors had issued sobering warnings about potential developmental delays, lingering respiratory issues, a dozen severe complications that might arise from his sudden, early arrival. Instead, James had simply thrived. He had walked at 13 months, confidently said his first word, "Mama," at 10 months, and had been reliably sleeping through the night since they brought him home from the hospital. He was sharp, healthy, and possessed a stubborn, focused determination that Aurora claimed he'd inherited equally from both sides of the family. "How's my favorite engineer?" Aurora's voice drifted out from the front door. She stood silhouetted in the doorway, wearing scrubs from her shift at the hospital, carrying the particular kind of tired, grateful smile that meant she'd had a good, exhausting day successfully helping other people's children. "He's designing a new bubble catching system," Sullivan said, standing to deliver a long, appreciative kiss to his wife. "Hello." A very innovative approach involving running in rapid, unpredictable circles and sustained giggling. Aurora laughed, settling herself beside Sullivan on the wide steps to observe their son's chaotic pursuit. At 34, she was, if anything, even more luminous than she'd been on their wedding day, her face etched with the quiet confidence and earned contentment of a woman who had fought hard for her happiness and unequivocally won. "How was work today?" Sullivan asked, noting the faint shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. "Busy. Good busy. We had a little girl come into the pediatric ward today who reminded me so much of James when he was tiny. Same fighting spirit." Aurora leaned her head against Sullivan's shoulder, a gesture of deep familiarity. "How was your day?" "Productive. The NASA contract came through officially this morning. Vane Industries will be designing the primary propulsion system for the new Mars mission." "That's incredible," Rory whispered. Aurora turned to face him fully, her hazel eyes bright with unreserved pride. "Sullivan, do you truly realize what this means? You're literally helping humanity reach for the stars." Sullivan felt a familiar, deep surge of satisfaction, not merely for the professional achievement, but for the profound, meaningful way Aurora celebrated his successes as if they were her own personal victories, too. Starting his own company 2 years ago had been both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a massive professional leap into the void. But having Aurora's steadfast, unwavering support had made all the critical difference. Vane Industries now employed 43 people, had secured lucrative contracts with NASA, SpaceX, and 3 major international space agencies, and was rapidly developing next-generation technology that promised to revolutionize long-haul space exploration. More significantly, it was a company built entirely on genuine collaboration rather than punitive control, radical innovation rather than suffocating fear, and the kind of visionary, expansive thinking that had been absolutely impossible when Sullivan was living only to manage his father's impossible expectations instead of following his own instincts. Daddy. James had momentarily abandoned the bubbles and was climbing the porch steps with the determined, serious expression he wore whenever he had something of critical importance to communicate. Story time. After your nap, little man. Story now. James tried his most persuasive, dazzling smile, the one that usually worked instantly on Aurora, but had slightly less success with Sullivan's engineering precision about schedules. Nice try, buddy. Nap first, then story time. James considered this complex negotiation seriously, then nodded with the solemn dignity of someone who fully understood the eventual value of delayed gratification. Okay, Daddy, but the story about the rocket? Absolutely. The story about the rocket. Aurora scooped James up, laughing gently when he immediately melted and cuddled against her shoulder with the complete, unreserved trust that children naturally reserve for parents who have proven themselves reliably present. Come on, little astronaut. Let's get you settled down. As Aurora carried James inside for his nap, Sullivan remained sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the tree-lined neighborhood where they'd consciously built their life together. The house immediately next door belonged to Dr. Meredith Foster and her wife, Sarah, who had grown to be like true family over the past 2 years. Mrs. Chun still lived on the other side, though her recovery from surgery had been slower and more difficult than Aurora's post-C-section healing. Sullivan's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The sender's name made him pause, his thumb hovering over the screen. Richard Vane. Asterisk saw the news about the NASA contract. Congratulations. It was the first piece of communication Sullivan had received from his father in 6 months, since the last awkward, failed attempt at a relationship that had ended predictably with Richard criticizing James's perceived lack of discipline and Aurora's permissive parenting style. Sullivan considered typing a response, a simple polite acknowledgement, then consciously decided against it. Some bridges, he knew now, were burned far beyond any hope of repair, and the profound, hard-won peace he had finally found was too sacred, too valuable to risk for the sake of a relationship that had consistently brought him nothing but prolonged pain. Aurora returned to the porch 20 minutes later, having changed out of her hospital scrubs into comfortable jeans and one of Sullivan's old college t-shirts that had somehow permanently migrated into her wardrobe. He's out cold, she reported, settling back onto the steps right beside Sullivan. Started telling me about the rocket story before his eyes even closed. He's completely obsessed with space travel lately. I wonder where he gets that from, Aurora said with mock theatrical seriousness. They sat in profound, comfortable silence for a while, watching their neighborhood come slowly to life around them. Children were playing loudly in front yards. Neighbors were walking their dogs. It was the ordinary, quiet magic of a late summer evening in Seattle. I have something to tell you, Aurora said eventually, her voice carrying a soft, significant note that made Sullivan turn to look at her directly. Good something or concerning something? Good something. Very good something. Aurora smiled, reaching for his hand, her touch deliberate. I'm pregnant. For a flashing, agonizing moment, Sullivan felt an echo of the old fear, the automatic spike of anxiety that had consumed him when Aurora first shared this news 2 years ago. But it lasted only a breath, seconds at most, before being utterly overwhelmed and consumed by a wave of pure, expansive joy. Really? Really? 8 weeks along. I wanted to be absolutely sure before I told you. Sullivan felt unexpected tears gathering in his eyes, stinging slightly. How do you feel? Excited? Happy? A little nervous about managing 2 kids under 3 years old, honestly, but mostly just overwhelmingly grateful that we get to do this again. Sullivan kissed her. A long, deep kiss, tasting salt and happiness and the boundless promise of another chapter in the life they were consciously building together. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words carrying all the complex weight of everything they'd endured and everything they were now building. "I love you too. All of you." As if magically summoned by their conversation, James appeared in the doorway, his hair wonderfully messy from sleep and his favorite stuffed rocket tucked securely under his arm. "No more nap," he announced with the undeniable authority of someone who had officially decided the rest period was over. "Did you have a good sleep, sweetheart?" Aurora asked, opening her arms to accept the fierce cuddles that James always freely dispensed after naps. "Dream about flying?" James settled comfortably between his parents on the porch steps. "Flying to the moon. Maybe someday you will fly to the moon," Sullivan said, gently ruffling his son's hair. "Would you like that?" James considered this vast possibility seriously. "With mommy and daddy. With whoever you want, buddy and baby brother." Sullivan and Aurora exchanged startled glances over James's head. They hadn't told him about the pregnancy yet, and they certainly hadn't even discussed whether they wanted to know the baby's sex this time. "How do you know about a baby brother?" Aurora asked carefully, intrigued. James merely shrugged, with the casual, profound wisdom of toddlers everywhere. "Just know mommy's tummy has baby like before I was born." Aurora laughed softly, shaking her head at their son's intuitive grasp of complicated family dynamics. "Well, there might be a baby. We'll have to wait and see." "Baby brother," James repeated with absolute certainty, then brightened again. "Story time now. Story time now." "Story time now," Sullivan agreed, pulling the 2 of them closer as the 3 of them settled onto the porch swing that Aurora had lovingly insisted they needed for moments exactly like this. Sullivan felt the kind of profound, encompassing contentment he'd never believed possible during those months when fear had driven his every decision. James curled up securely between his parents, clutching his beloved rocket while Sullivan began telling the story of brave astronauts who explored distant planets and eventually discovered that the single most important thing they could ever bring on their adventures was the fierce love for the people waiting for them back home. The story was entirely improvised, probably scientifically ludicrous, and definitely sentimental. But James listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking profound questions about rocket fuel efficiency or hypothetical alien civilizations, with the seriousness of someone who fully expected to encounter these specific challenges personally someday soon. As the Seattle sun began its dramatic descent behind the Olympic Mountains, painting their porch in rich golden light, Sullivan realized, with stunning clarity, that this precise moment, sitting with his small, growing family, telling improbable stories about space exploration while Aurora's hand rested protectively over their second child, was everything his mother had died hoping he would have. The gnawing fear that had controlled him for 37 years seemed like a relic from another lifetime. A story about a different, lesser man who had been too afraid to simply reach for happiness. That man had missed the first 3 months of James's life, had nearly lost Aurora through his own deliberate cowardice, had spent years constructing thick walls instead of bridges. This man, the one telling rocket stories on a front porch while his pregnant wife laughed quietly at his dramatic sound effects and his son meticulously planned future space missions. This man had learned how to choose love over fear every single day. "Daddy," James said as the story wound down, yawning again, "when I go to space, will you help me build my rocket?" "Absolutely, buddy. We'll build the best rocket anyone's ever seen. And mommy can come too. If mommy wants to come, we'll make sure there's room for her. And baby brother. And baby brother too." James nodded with deep satisfaction, apparently having resolved all the major logistical details for his future career as an astronaut. He yawned again, hugely. The combination of afternoon adventures and story time was finally catching up with him. "Time for real bedtime, little man," Aurora said, scooping him up gently from the swing. As Aurora carried James inside to begin the soothing bedtime routine, Sullivan remained on the porch, watching the first brilliant stars become visible in the rapidly darkening sky. His phone buzzed again, probably work emails or congratulatory messages from colleagues, but he ignored it completely. This moment, this feeling of complete peace and overwhelming gratitude, was too precious, too significant to interrupt with the outside world. Aurora returned about 20 minutes later, settling back onto the swing beside him. "He wants you to come say good night," she said, her voice amused. "Something about making sure you explain the rocket story to his stuffed animals for context." Sullivan laughed, standing to go fulfill his fatherly duties. "Did I mention I love our life? Only about a dozen times today, but I never get tired of hearing it." After saying goodnight to James and providing the requested rocket story summary to an attentive audience of stuffed animals, Sullivan found Aurora in their bedroom, already changed into the soft pajamas that somehow made her look even younger than her 34 years. She was sitting on their bed holding a small ultrasound photo that she must have gotten at her appointment earlier that week, before the emergency. "I was waiting for the right moment to show you this," she said, handing him the small black and white image. Sullivan studied the photo, immediately recognizing the familiar bean-shaped form that looked so much like James's first ultrasound pictures, yet also different. This baby looked more developed, more clearly human in its emerging details. "Everything looks perfect," Aurora said. "Dr. Chun says." The physician's estimation confirmed the date, April 15th. A spring baby, arriving right as the world turned green again. A fresh start in every way. This new little one would have a dedicated mentor in their big brother, James, ready to share every detail about rockets, distant stars, and the grand challenge of space exploration. Sullivan carefully placed the blurry ultrasound photo on his mahogany nightstand. It rested beside a worn, slightly creased picture of James, a snapshot he'd tucked into his wallet and carried like a talisman for the past 2 years. "Are you hoping for a boy or a girl this time?" "I'm hoping for healthy," Sullivan murmured, adjusting his position so he could inhale the scent of her hair. "Everything else is simply a magnificent bonus." He settled fully onto the mattress beside Aurora, immediately drawing her into the protective warmth of his arms. He rested his palm gently against the slight, miraculous curve of her belly where their second child was quietly flourishing. "I genuinely can't believe we get to do this again, Aurora." He felt a thrill of nerves mixed with profound contentment. "I'm scared, just a little, but it's a good scared. The excited kind of scared. Not the soul-crushing, paralyzing fear that used to dictate and control every single choice I made." Aurora shifted within his embrace, turning her body so she could look straight into his eyes, her expression thoughtful and searching. "Do you ever allow yourself to consider what would have happened if you hadn't ultimately fought through that fear? If you had let that destructive anxiety win?" Sullivan regarded the question seriously. Only 2 years ago, the reflex would have been to instantly deflect or pivot the conversation. Now, he welcomed the opportunity to examine even the most painful, difficult possibilities. "I think I would have lost you," he admitted quietly. "I believe I would have inevitably become a mirror image of my father, perpetually isolated, consumed by bitterness, potentially surrounded by immense professional success and technological achievement, but completely hollowed out of anything that truly matters." He paused, tenderly running his fingers through the silky strands of Aurora's hair. "And worse, I think I would have missed the absolute miracle of knowing James, of getting to watch him grow into this incredible, perceptive little human who finds pure, unadulterated wonder in everything he sees. Do you think your father will ever truly comprehend the depth of what he chose to miss?" "I don't know. I hope so, profoundly, for his own sake. But I can't control his choices anymore. I can only take ownership of mine." They drifted into a comfortable, deep silence. Aurora rested her head snugly on his shoulder, while Sullivan absently traced complex, soothing patterns on her arm, his mind painting the vivid future they were constructing together. James, he knew, was destined to be the most amazing, patient big brother. Their new baby would thrive in a home saturated with unconditional love, spontaneous laughter, and nightly bedtime stories detailing the furthest reaches of space exploration. Aurora would continue her essential work, saving young lives with her surgical brilliance at the hospital, while he focused on designing the groundbreaking technology needed to help humanity realize its dream of reaching for the stars. This wasn't a perfect life. No life ever truly was. Perfection was an illusion. Challenges certainly lay ahead. The wearying, sleepless nights demanded by a newborn, the delightful chaos of managing two young, energetic children, and the mundane but relentless struggles that inevitably affect every family. But they would navigate these hurdles together, standing side by side as two fiercely committed partners who had already weathered emotional storms and proven they could survive anything, as long as they consistently chose love over debilitating fear. "Thank you," Sullivan whispered. "For what?" "For fighting for us when I was so utterly afraid I couldn't fight for myself. For seeing and believing in the potential of the man I could become when I was completely incapable of seeing past the damaged man I was. For the gifts of James, and now this precious new baby, and the life-altering chance to definitively break the destructive, generational patterns that had unjustly defined my family for far too long." Aurora lifted her head from his shoulder, meeting his gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears and profound emotion. "You fought just as hard, Sullivan. You made the painful choice to change fundamentally when it would have been infinitely simpler just to remain paralyzed by your fear. You chose us, knowing it meant dismantling and giving up everything you previously believed defined your worth. It was the best decision I ever made," he affirmed instantly. "Second best," Aurora gently corrected, her smile radiant and playful. "What was the first best? Marrying me in the first place?" Sullivan's deep laugh rumbled through his chest, and he pulled her even tighter. "You're absolutely right. Marrying you was the foundational, first best decision. Every single genuinely good, meaningful thing in my life began with that one defining choice." As they settled down to sleep, the quiet rhythm of their breathing syncing up, Aurora's hand naturally rested over her slightly swollen belly, while Sullivan's arm encircled them both, a secure fortress. He let his thoughts drift back to the rocket story he had enthusiastically shared with James earlier that evening. A tale of brave explorers who ventured to distant, unknown worlds, yet never forgot that the single most important thing was the abiding, constant love waiting for them back home. For most of his adult life, he had been conditioned to believe that love itself was the danger, that genuine connection was a catastrophic liability, and that caring too deeply would inexorably lead to agonizing, devastating loss. Now, finally, he understood the truth. Love was not the peril. Love was the destination itself. It was the core reason for taking necessary risks, for pushing far beyond comfortable, safe zones, for consciously choosing courage over entrenched fear every single daybreak. Tomorrow, he would awaken in this beautiful, imperfect house, alongside this extraordinary woman and their remarkable son, with another child preparing to join their fold, and a company that was quite literally helping humanity stretch its grasp toward the distant stars. His mornings would be filled with spontaneous conversations about rocket fuel over coffee, and his evenings reserved for elaborate bedtime stories about the wonders of cosmic travel. He would continue, deliberately, to build a life that honored his mother's memory. Not through the cold, isolating fear his father had championed, but through vibrant joy, genuine connection, and the enveloping, steadfast love that made every struggle worthwhile. And if, by some miracle, his father ever chose to put love before his crippling, relentless need to be universally right, there would still be space for him in this new life, too. But if he didn't, Sullivan was finally, truly at peace with that boundary. Some souls tragically spend their entire existence confined and controlled by fear. There was simply nothing Sullivan could do to rescue someone who fundamentally refused to be saved. The only existence he had the power to guide was his own. And for the rest of his days, he was choosing love, every single purposeful day. 2 years later, the lessons had crystallized into absolute certainty. Sullivan Vane understood, beyond all doubt, that his father had been wrong about every essential matter. Love did not equate to weakness. On the contrary, it forged an inner resilience, making one brave enough to fight fiercely for everything worth protecting. Building a family was not a dangerous liability. It was the most glorious and challenging adventure imaginable, and choosing happiness, vulnerability, and engagement over the cold security of fear wasn't reckless abandon. It was, in fact, the single most rational and necessary decision he had ever made. As he finally drifted into the deep peace of sleep, nestled beside the woman who had courageously saved him from the worst, self-destructive instincts of his own legacy. With their son dreaming expansively about the cosmos in the adjacent room and their second child safe and thriving within Aurora's womb, Sullivan finally grasped the profound, final truth his mother had died hoping he would learn. Love is always inherently worth the risk. The only true tragedy is being too afraid even to try. We leave Sullivan and Aurora in the quiet dawn of their new reality, having made their choice. What decision would you have made in Sullivan's place? Would you have chosen love over fear, even fully aware of the life-altering risks involved? Your participation means the world to our channel. Please share your reflective thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you sincerely for watching this journey. If you enjoyed the unfolding of the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know what resonated with you. Your feedback and steadfast support are invaluable to us. Stay tuned for more exciting and emotionally resonant stories.
My flat sings wipers to the sky. Melodies flows gentle and free, carrying dreams across the sea. In every note a piece of me, forever here in harmony. My flat sings wipers to the sky. Melodies flows gentle and free, carrying dreams across the sea. In every note a piece of me, forever here in harmony. Music lives inside my heart. Music lives inside my heart.